Hello everyone and welcome to Blender 101, the first class session of the 6-week-long Blender course offered by 3D Buzz. Just wanted to welcome everybody who has shown up today for the live session. If you are not watching this live, if you're instead watching the streamed version a little bit later, please feel free at any time to pause the video and send me questions via PM or email, and I'll answer those as soon as I can. My PM address over on the 3D Buzz website is just Zach, Z-A-K, and my email address is Zach, Z-A-K, @3dbuzz.com, and I'll help you out with everything I can.
We should have this video encoded and uploaded a little bit later on today, being Saturday, the day of this class. And for those of you that have yet to discover where these videos are going, the easiest way to get to them is from the front page of 3D Buzz, or any page on 3D Buzz, for that matter. At the top in the menu bar, if you will, on the web page, there is a live classes link. Just click on that, and it's a very simple page for the moment as it's being worked on as time permits, but there's a calendar, and you can see where all of the different classes are, and each class that completes, you basically get a watch link that appears there, and you can just click on that and watch the video.
Absolutely. Which, if they're hearing this, they've probably already done that.
Not necessarily.
Yeah?
Yeah, because they just went to the lounge, the member sponsor lounge, to get the data.
That's true. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is going over a few Blender basics. I'm not going to turn this into a big, long, drawn-out entry-level class, but I do want to go over a few basic navigation things for those of you who might have missed the little free Wednesday or Thursday session we had about a week and a half back. Then we're going to be taking a look at, well, actually, you know what? Let me do this the way that I generally prefer to do stuff, and that is by writing some stuff out. And that really used to say hello. I just want to point that out. And I erased the O because, well, long story.
That's pretty funny.
I think so. Okay, so today, let's go write the date down. So it's Saturday, March the 3rd, isn't it?
Yeah.
All day long. It's like March is already flying by. Well, today we are going to do a really quick Blender intro. So if you're familiar with Blender, don't be alarmed. We're not going to be spending a great deal of time, but I do want to go over some basic navigation stuff for those of you who might be completely new, maybe if you missed the last session. Then we are going to be taking a look at getting our project started. So I'm actually going to be showing you guys our golf ball project, our talented golfer ball, or I don't even know if I have an official title for this. So we're going to look at the actual project, and I'm waiting for a little bit of lag here.
Yeah, Photoshop seems to be giving a bit more lag than usual with the webinar stuff running.
I think it's Nelson's stuff that's making it happen.
Oh, okay.
I do want to throw this out as an aside. I am going to be using Photoshop as my whiteboarding software, just because that's really what I'm used to. I know in the project syllabus we mentioned the use of GIMP. I will be using that for the texturing process and anything that you need to follow along with. All this whiteboarding stuff is what I do just to put some notes on the screen to make things easier for you guys. So don't worry about the fact that I'm using Photoshop for that. That's totally cool. So we'll take a look at the project, and then we are going to start by going over some storyboards. Now that's going to sound a little bit backwards to some of you, because if you're just starting out a project on your own, you generally don't have a render to look at first. But I just want to kind of show everybody where we're going and then how we're going to get there. So we're going to take a look at storyboards. We're going to talk about the importance of storyboarding when you're actually setting up your own projects. And from there, once we've kind of discussed that, we're going to move on to our actual setup for the project. There are some things we need to handle inside of Blender, make sure that we have our settings all just right and things are ready to go. At that point, we will be working inside of Blender for the rest of the session. And our final goal today, this is probably going to be the biggest key area of what we accomplish today, is we are going to create some animatics. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the term animatics, you might have heard the term layout before. And if you're also unfamiliar with that, then don't worry. We're going to talk about what that is, why it's important, why you'd create them, and then I'm going to walk you through the creation of them. This is going to require that we do a lot of things that are actually on the docket throughout the syllabus for the remainder of the class. We're going to be taking a look at some very, very basic modeling. We're going to be taking a look at some basic animation. We're going to be making use of the graph editor to clean up a few curves just so we have something that looks a little more believable, but we're not going to spend a great deal of time really ironing out and finessing anything. Now, I do want to mention, though, if you are new to the graph editor, if you're new to the concept of keyframe animation at this point, then it's going to be important for you to just kind of follow along in sort of a do as I'm doing, monkey see, monkey do kind of fashion. Because once we get to the animation section of this class, which is in a few weeks from now, then I'm going to be talking at length about keyframe animation, about dealing with keyframes, Bezier curves inside your curve editor, or other types of curves as well. Then it's at that point we're going to be taking a look at things like rigging and whatnot. So this is what we have on the docket for today. Now, before we really get rolling, I do want to take just a moment because we still got a couple of people who are coming in, and there are already some questions that are lining up. I just want to kind of grab a few of those and just make sure that everybody is sort of on the same page. So somebody said, how late am I? You're not late at all. We haven't even really got super started yet.
Oh, we started 2 hours early. You've missed so much.
Yeah, that's why Jason's here, to give everybody a hard time.
I'm not on stuff.
All right. Now, for those of you who are using the BuzzNet application, which I do want to mention this, by the way. If you're not watching this live, please don't bother with BuzzNet. It's not going to help you at all. BuzzNet is something that we have put together to aid in live participation. If you're not watching live, then BuzzNet will be pretty useless to you. And I've already had that asked to me a couple of times via PM. So. If you are using BuzzNet, make sure that you are in participate mode. I will be doing a couple of ready checks here and there, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. If you are not using BuzzNet, if you don't have it running, please don't be alarmed. That's fine. There are a few reasons why BuzzNet won't run on some machines, if you're running on a Mac, if you're running on Linux, and that's okay. Just make sure you put your questions over into the webinar system.
Yes, and please go ahead and use your 3D Buzz login details into BuzzNet because that's tied into the 3D Buzz site. So it's not going to be the password or anything weird that's from the webinar as far as joining into BuzzNet.
Right. If you can get into the BuzzNet site, you're good to go. And
helping me point out questions to Zach a little bit easier today, if everyone asking questions could please just use the webinar question panel, that we'd have everything in one area consistent, which would be nice. And
I also want to throw this out, please. If you are just chatting to us, if you're just like, if you're responding to something we say, like just a second ago, Jason was saying, we've been going on for 2 hours, and somebody's like, oh no, 2 hours, just making like cute little comments. Please try to keep that out of the webinar question system, just in case. We don't want to get that too cluttered. So please try to restrict yourself to just throwing questions in there. We do have the IRC chat if you just want to talk to people, and BuzzNet chat, of course, has its own little chat window as well.
Yeah, and the IRC, while I know I'm in it at the moment, I'm just letting you guys know for anyone that tries to message me over there right now, it is completely...
We're not looking at it.
Yeah, it's completely put away it's minimized, basically.
Right. So
we got enough windows going on at the moment.
We're restricting all actual official class questions strictly to the webinar system. So
one last thing I'd like to point out for those of you that are running the BuzzNet application, there is a little mini bar that will attach itself to the webinar screen in which you are viewing Zach's screen right now. And this is you have to actually use the arrow key first, Zach.
Oh, okay.
And then you can start dragging.
Okay. I've just got to get to something underneath that, sorry.
But once you recognize that button, you find it. Basically, this is where Zach has the ability to set the ready check. So right now, just to demonstrate for those of you that are inside of the BuzzNet app.
And are participating.
I just reset it. Everybody should be able to find it real quick, and then you'll see there's some little icons there. You can go ahead and click ready. Again, this is if you have activated the participating button. This way, we know that as you are following along with things that Zach is having you guys do, that those of you that are participating are done. And if you are not done, we know to sit here and wait for you a little longer or to ask if there is a problem.
Robert Preston, there is a download link for BuzzNet over in the member sponsor lounge. In the forums on 3D Buzz, there is a thread entitled BuzzNet Problems, Suggestions, and a download link. I think there may be one other word in there I couldn't remember, but...
Yeah, but it starts off with BuzzNet.
That's right, and the very first post has a download link where you can grab that. Okay, so I think we've got a nice breakdown of where we're going today. I don't see any questions really pertaining to any of this, which is cool. So let's see here. Let me jump out of here and to one of the many other applications we've got going right now.
And a question from Dave, which was, so when the bar is yellow, then you are waiting for a response from me. Yes, when you've done whatever it is that's being asked of you to do, just at that point, just simply click on the...
Oh, we've maxed out the webinar.
Have we? No, well, we haven't.
Well, that's what the webinar is.
I don't know what that's saying. We have 68
people.
Hang on one second, guys. We just had our first message that actually does not make sense from the webinar.
Yeah, unless like 32 people just logged in all at the same time, which I highly doubt.
Yeah, that is incorrect.
I think we'll be okay.
Yeah.
But it is still climbing.
No, Annie, we did not see something like that last week. We have never actually seen that message before.
Okay, so here we are inside of Blender. Before we do too much in terms of our actual project today, I do want to go over a few things. Now, just curious, really. I'd like to get an idea of how many people in here actually saw the last little free session that we did. I'm going to reset our ready thing for those of you who are actually in BuzzNet.
I have another way to do it.
Another way to do it?
This way, every single person will be involved, and that is if you use...
Raise hands?
Yeah, use your little raise hand thing.
Yeah, this is cool.
Over on the...
I'm going to tell that not to show again next time. Yeah, raise your hand if you're actually in the free session.
There you go.
Last time around. I'm just curious, really. And how about we click Don't Show Again and click OK. And there we go. So a fair few people. All right, now at this point, everybody put your hands down.
Hey, look at that.
Hey, they follow direction. It's so amazing. I feel like I have so much power. All right.
Well, most.
I'm going to click.
There you go. All right.
Because now I do have power. All right. No, I'm putting all hands down. Now, if you are totally new to Blender, meaning you didn't watch that last session, because I'm going to assume if you watched that last session, you're no longer a complete and total noob. If you're totally new to Blender, raise your hand. A couple of people? Oh, ooh. Yeah, don't be shy. If you're new to Blender, just let me know. Okay, well, that's very cool. So we got a little bit of a mix of experience levels today, which is totally fine for what we're going to be doing. What I want to do first is give everybody a down and dirty introduction to Blender itself. Now, this is not going to be a long and involved thing. We have plenty of pre-recorded videos that will get you through the nuances of Blender, but since you're here, there's a few things you ought to know. First thing is that I'm going to start off today by adjusting some settings. And you're welcome to adjust these along with me. If you already are a Blender user and you don't want to use the same settings that I am, please, I'm not trying to make you change any of your settings, but there are some things I'm going to do that will make it easier on you, and of course easier on me. First is because I started Blender and I already have some geometry in the view, I'm going to go over to File and choose Load Factory Settings. The cool thing about doing this is this puts Blender in the same state it is when you first download it, which should put everybody who wants to be on the same page. Again, I just want to stress, for what I'm about to do, I've got some preferences that I'm going to be setting up. If you want to follow along and have the same preferences as me, that's awesome. If you don't, of course, that's not really a requirement. The very first thing I'm going to do is jump over to my user preferences. I like to do this before I change anything else in my scene. So let's go over to user preferences. And this is the first thing I'm going to do. Has nothing to do with you guys, so you don't necessarily have to do this. I'm going to jump over to add-ons and go over to screencast keys and go ahead and just save that out. Then I'm going to press the N key, N as in November, and scroll down and turn on my screencast keys. Really, that's just a way for you guys to see what buttons I'm clicking while I'm working. If you are just following along with me, you really don't need that, but I just wanted to point that out. Now, some settings that I really like inside of Blender, which I want to go ahead and get out of the way now before we roll. Over inside the Blender user preferences, if you jump over to the input panel, I am a big fan of selecting with the left mouse button because I have been using computers for a very long time now, and every single application that I've ever used allows me to select things with left mouse. except Blender. So I'm going to be bringing Blender back over into what I'm used to and selecting with left mouse. I know that Blender has a lot of reasons for choosing right. It's just not something that I am super used to, particularly because of the fact that I go back and forth between a lot of different applications. So that's one thing that I do like to set. Another one that I think is huge and important, and this is one of the few settings that I will stress that you probably should consider turning on, is continuous grab. Now, what this allows you to do is take a particular setting, like a slider or a manipulator, and you can start dragging it, and your cursor can go right off the screen, and you can just keep right on moving. It keeps your cursor from restricting the overall motion of whatever it is you're adding. So I would highly recommend that you set that up. Now, something else about Blender that will frustrate some newcomers, and I just want to fix, is inside of the view. I can click on something and I can select it. That's cool. We're used to that. And if you want to keep using your right mouse button again, that's fine. I'm now using my left mouse button, as we saw a second ago. But if I click out here in space, that doesn't deselect stuff. Now, I come from a world where clicking out in space generally means deselect stuff. And so I get a little frustrated when I can't do that. Now, just for those of you who are complete and total Blender noobs, that's awesome. But if you want to deselect stuff inside of Blender, you generally will tap the A key. A is in alpha and Apple and things like that. A also selects all. If you have nothing selected, you can tap A and that's going to select everything. But that's not enough for me. So I'm going to jump back over to my user preferences. We're going to go over to our input section. And I'm going to actually set up a really quick hotkey system that allows me to just click off in space and make this stuff go away. We have to do this twice. We need to, well, at least twice. We need to do it for object mode and for mesh mode. So I'm going to go over to object mode. And if you scroll down here in your settings, you've got select or deselect all, which is currently slaved to the A key. If you expand this, you get the command that's actually being fired. I'm going to select that and hit Control-C. And we're done here. We can go ahead and close that all up. Let's scroll down to the bottom of this list, and we'll click Add New. Now, currently this is set to none. We're going to expand that, take our little none area, and paste in our command. Now, of course, that immediately says select or deselect all. That's perfect. Now, this is still set to the A key because Blender's pretty smart. It knows that that command is generally going to be set to A. We're going to click on that, and then click again to set that to left mouse. Now, currently, this is looking for a button press. We don't want to do that. We want to set this to click. And then the action is currently set to toggle. We're just going to set that to deselect. Now, we can go ahead and click Save as Default. Now, just as a reminder, this is in object mode, not in edit mode. So if we're playing with vertices, edges, that sort of thing, this would do us no good, but we can still test it out. So go ahead and click Save as Default, and now I can click on an object and click out in space, and it deselects.
Yay, it's like a regular 3D program.
I know, it's delicious. So let's go back in there one more time, and we're going to do the same thing. So if you missed it, we're going to do it again, but this time we're going to do it in mesh mode. Now, if there were other types of objects that you wanted to use, you'd want to make sure that you went through, and anywhere that the A key was slaved off, you'd want to do the same thing. But really, I'm only interested in object mode and mesh mode for the time being. Same thing. You'll notice as you scroll down, there's select and deselect all, which is currently slaved over to the A key. Just expand that. It's the same command. It's just now instead of saying object.selectAll, it says mesh.selectAll. We'll hit Control-C. Close this up because we don't need it anymore. Scroll way down. Click Add New. Expand that. Paste in our command and press Enter. Click again to switch that over to left mouse. Make sure we set that to click and set the action to deselect. And that's it. That's all there is to it. We can go ahead and click Save as Default, and let's give this a quick test. So I'll select my block, hit Tab, and we can grab a vertex, and a vertex, and a vertex, and then click out in space, and everything's deselected. So very, very handy thing, especially if you've been using any other application in the world, really. It'll make you feel a lot more at home. Now, there's a couple of other user preferences that I generally like to set.
1 second. Before we change anything else, I'm just going to go ahead and hit the ready check over here. And anyone that's following along, is participating with this, go ahead and just check off that you've done it. If you're following along but you're not planning on doing this, go ahead and check off as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't have BuzzNet running and you need another second, just click on the raise hand thing over in the.
Yeah, make sure we're not raising your hand for ready. Raise your hand if you need another second. If we see no hands go up, we know you're ready to go.
Exactly.
See, and the hand went back down, which is great. Could you repeat that one last time? Absolutely. Let me do this one more time. Check it out. We're going to go to, now, do you mean specifically setting up the hotkeys? I'm going to assume you do. So watch this. We're going to go to File, jump down to User Preferences, over in Inputs. I'll go ahead and close everything up so you see what you generally see. Now, what we're working on is objects that are in the 3D view, so make sure that's where your attention is in the 3D view. We're going to need to do this in two separate areas, Object Mode and Mesh Mode. Somebody asked if I could do Edit Mode, which is, it's going to be the same thing as Object. It's just looking for the same command again. So, you'll simply expand whichever mode you want to work in. Find whatever is slave to the A key, because by default it's going to be your select and deselect all. So really what I do is I keep my eyes cut over here in the list for the letter A, and that makes things a lot easier. Go ahead and expand this out to see what command is being fired. This bar here shows you what actual command is being triggered when you tap the A key. We're going to select that command and hit Control-C, which is your standard for copy. Now, once you have that copied to your clipboard, we're kind of done here, so we can just scroll down to the bottom, like so. And just to show off, I'll go ahead and close this out. I'll just make a brand new one. So this is what you'd see by default. There wouldn't be anything here. We'll click on Add New, and that'll give you a new entry called None. We'll expand that. And of course, the command also says none, which is not what we want at all. We're going to paste in that command that we copied just a second ago, which is mesh.select_all. You could type this out, of course, if you knew the command off the top of your head, but because I don't like to type if I don't have to, we're just doing copy-paste. Now, we need to set the proper button for doing this. Currently, it's still set to the A key, which does us no good. So we'll click on this, and that's going to have Blender tell us to press a key. Just click on it a second time, and that will set that over to the left mouse button. The catch here, and this is easy to overlook, is that Blender is still looking for a button press, hence the press keyword here. So if we click this and set this over to click, it is now officially looking for a mouse click, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. Now we're going to go over to the action and change this from toggle to deselect. And there we go, we're done. Go ahead and click Save as Default, and you can test this out by going into Edit Mode, selecting any component that you like, and just click out in space to make sure that it gets deselected. So hopefully that will cover that for everybody who needs to do that, because really, I love me some Blender, I really do, and I'm not saying anything negative about the application at all, but the whole thing about not being able to click out in space to deselect stuff just frustrated me to no end. So there's how you fix that. Now, there's a couple of other things that I want to be able to set, which, if you at least know that I've got them on, will probably save you a little confusion further on down the road. So I'm going to jump back into my user preferences, and I'm going to jump into the editing menu. One of the things that I like to have is release confirms, and what this means is that if I just grab something and drag it, I can start moving it, and as soon as I let go of my mouse button, we're no longer moving it. So if you watch this, I'm going to go into edit mode by hitting the tab key, and I'm just going to click and drag on a vertex, and that vertex will just start following my mouse immediately. As soon as I let go of my mouse, bink, it gets left behind and stops moving. Now, for those of you who actually like the follow behavior, where you just start dragging and it just stays with you until you click again, of course you don't have to set that preference. But the reason I like this is I know that at any time I can just tap the G key and it's going to follow my mouse anyway. So no worries there. Now let's go back in. We're not quite finished setting up our preferences. Another couple that I really appreciate, if we go under the interface panel, we have auto perspective. I like to make sure that this is on just in case. This means that when I go into an orthographic view, we automatically go into orthographic. So if I go to a side view, we lose depth. As soon as I try to rotate the view, I no longer will get a user view that is still in orthographic mode. It's automatically going to snap and give me some depth, which is very nice. And we're just double checking. We got a question here. Folks are trying to get into the webinar. It says session full.
Right now, we actually have Angela who is calling. You can tell anyone that's in the IRC that is saying that to go ahead and try again. I mean, there's 68 people in the class, and our class sizes are 500. So obviously, we are nowhere close to. Again, Angie's calling.
Okay.
That's outside of our hands right now. So.
Yeah. So just making sure. All right, so the other one that I like, and this is again just personal preferences, I really dig zoom to mouse position because it means I can put my cursor wherever I want, scroll the mouse wheel, and that's where I'm going to go. So those are all of my settings. I just wanted to make sure that everybody at least knows the ones that I'm using. So if it feels like I'm doing something that's behaving a little different than yours, at least you'll know what that is. So just as a quick review, let me jump over to my magical whiteboard. And where'd my pen go? I ate my pen. So just a real quick, for those of you who want to use the same settings, under Input, we're using swap left and right, so you're selecting with left instead of right. Continuous grab. With my lovely handwriting. We set up the deselect hotkey, which, if you're still kind of sluggish on the setup of hotkeys, I highly recommend you practice that. Then under the editing panel, we took on release confirms. And then finally, under interface, we did auto perspective, and we did zoom to mouse position, which I'm going to say zoom, arrow, mouse. All right, so now all of our settings are all set up. The only other thing that I like to do inside of Blender is I hate the fact that by default I've got all of these objects in the scene that I don't necessarily want. I'm okay, and that's only generally okay, with a light and a camera, but I am going to take out our cube. I just don't like there to be any geometry if I can help it. So I'll take that out and then go back over to File and choose Save User Settings. That way when I do a File New Scene, this is what I get. I get a nice, clean presentation that's ready to go. Now the other thing that I do want to make sure is set for our work, and it's something that you don't have to stress too much right now, but it's a good idea to make sure that you have at least paid attention to it, is over in your Properties panel on the right-hand side. And if you're totally unfamiliar with where stuff is in Blender, just make sure you're following my mouse. On the right-hand side, you got this great big list of stuff and buttons and knobs and switches and dials. At the very top, you're going to see a little camera icon. These are your render properties. Make sure you click on that. And you should see frame rate. It's underneath dimensions. So if you don't see it for some reason, you need to expand dimensions, jump down under frame rate, and go ahead and set that to 30 frames per second for our work. Later on today, the animation that we'll be doing, I'm going to assume everybody is working in 30 frames a second. So if you render out and things feel a little sluggish, then at least you'll understand why, especially during playback, actually. All right, so with that, we have all of our settings ready to go in terms of Blender. So I'm going to do a really quick ready check for everybody to tell me if they're ready to go on to the next thing. And if you are ready and you don't have BuzzNet running, please just put your hand up over inside of the webinar, and we'll go on from there. And somebody, Mary, said, where to set FPS again, please? If you take a look over on the right-hand side of your default interface, you should see the Properties panel. At the very top is a series of buttons. Now, if you have something selected, this series of buttons will get kind of lengthy and it'll look a little different. But the leftmost one should generally be a little camera, and those are your render settings. Down underneath this list, you'll see dimensions, and within the dimensions group, you'll see frame rate, which you can set to 30 frames per second. All right, so looks like most folks are pretty much ready to go, so we'll go ahead and move on from here. Now, what I'm about to do is a little bit backwards, and I realize it's backwards, and oh, somebody has asked a question. Let me see if I can... What about moving around? Do we not use Maya settings? That's a really good question. I had mentioned in the free session, for those of you who followed along, that I would probably be using the Maya hotkey settings. Well, later on, I kind of felt bad about that, because if you're totally new to Blender, I don't necessarily want to restrict you to using the Blender hotkeys. So, I'm sorry, I don't want to restrict you to use the Maya hotkeys. So I'm going to use all the Blender hotkeys, and it'll be easier on everybody. Maybe a little harder on me, but that's okay. I can take it because I'm tough and stuff. All right. So I want to talk briefly about Blender, give everybody a really quick crash course on the interface and on navigating it. You're going to need to be at least vaguely familiar. I'm putting everybody's hands down over inside the webinar, by the way. So if you'll please either watch the webinar screen, if you have two monitors or two windows popped up where you can see what I'm doing and maybe have your own Blender interface handy, that's cool. If not, just pay attention to the webinar. Starting from the top, at the very top of the Blender interface, we have what looks to be a menu bar. But actually, this is like a transformer. There's more than meets the eye here, because not only is it just a regular menu bar, but it's got all kinds of other information across the top, which is why this is not just a menu bar. This is actually the info editor. And something you need to understand about the Blender interface is that each and every part of it is really just a modular little editor window, and you can change these to anything you want. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. But for now, it's important to know that the menu bar across the top is really an info editor. So keep that in the back of your head. Now, of course, you have a lot of the standard stuff up here. You have your file, which we're going to be going up to. You have the add menu, something we're going to be using a lot today, as opposed to Shift-A, which we'll probably use that a little bit too. If we move down from here, and this is using the native interface, meaning if you have just reset your factory settings and not changed anything about your user interface, you see a column on the left and a great big viewport just to the right of that, which is pretty much dominating your entire view. This viewport, along with the column on the left, are considered the 3D view editor. Now, the 3D view editor also has its own menu bar, and that menu bar is located across the bottom, which is just kind of Blender's standard. If you don't like that for some reason, if you're like, I can't handle having a menu bar on the bottom, you can right-click this and choose Flip to Top, and you'll notice that now puts the viewport's menu bar up across the top, which might make you feel a little more at home if you're using other applications such as Maya. But I kind of like having it at the bottom. I've become kind of used to that. Now, directly underneath our 3D view area, we have the timeline. This is where we're going to handle scrubbing forward through our timeline, hitting play, setting the start and end. We'll see a representation of all of our keyframes while we're animating. So, just an area where we handle all of our animation. On the right-hand side, we have this great big column that is completely covered in buttons, knobs, switches, dials. It's scary looking. It's terrifying if you've never seen it before. At the very top is this tiny little portion here. It looks like it's one great big column, but this is actually divided, and you can prove it. If you put your mouse right here on this border, you see you get a little splitter arrow. The upper area is the outliner. The outliner gives you a hierarchical breakdown of all of the objects in your scene. As we create objects today, you're going to see them pop up here, and you can select them right here inside the outliner. You can also control things like whether or not these objects are visible. So if I click on this little eye for the camera, you'll notice that in our view, the camera disappears. Now you also have the ability to control its selectivity. So if we turn off that little arrow, I can no longer click on the camera and select it. No matter what I do, it will not be selected. And then I can tell the renderer to ignore it as well, which is very nice. But again, this is the outliner. It's just a breakdown of all of the objects in your scene. As you have objects that are parented to other objects, and parenting is just one of those things that we'll have to talk about a little bit later as we go forward, you'll see the parented objects appear underneath their parents. More on that later. Now, directly under this, we have this massive list area. And this is the properties editor. This allows you to have access to all of the properties of whatever object you have selected. It's important to note that this area is context sensitive, meaning, if I go ahead and stretch it out a little bit, currently I have a camera selected. Now, you can't be too faked out by the fact that it shows a camera as the first icon. It's always going to show the render settings, and then the scene settings, and then the world settings. And then we have things like object. We have constraints. Sometimes you'll see modifiers in here. Then we have our object data, which currently shows a little camera. That's already giving you a clue that this is context sensitive. And then we have textures and physics and all sorts of things. But watch this. If I select another object, the options in here actually update. So now the object data is for lights. If I was to add a piece of geometry for some reason and click on the geometry, we get a whole new selection of options. So just understand that the properties area is just a context-sensitive area where you're going to go to access all of the different properties for the objects in your scene. Okay, so now moving on from here. That's just pretty much a really quick rundown of the interface. Now, the interface is highly modifiable, and the big reason I want to go over just a little bit of interface editing is because if I don't, somebody is bound to do something they probably shouldn't do. And you'll get confused because you can actually make the interface kind of scary if you're not really careful. You might have noticed that all across the interface you have these little splitter arrows that will pop up, meaning you can drag stuff around and you can resize editors at will. So we can take the viewport and we can make it smaller, make the timeline huge. We can take the properties area and resize it, or even take the outliner and make it a lot longer. You have all this kind of power, but you have other things as well. Every single one of these panels I've discussed, whether it's the outliner, the properties area, the timeline, they all, if you take a close look, have these little diagonal lines in the upper right corner and the lower left corner. You'll use these diagonal lines when you really want to start updating the interface. If you take these diagonal lines and you just drag to the left, or basically if you drag into an editor or a window, you're going to split that window into another copy. So let me go ahead and just get rid of that real quick, and I'll talk about what I'm doing in a moment. So one more time. If you take these diagonal lines in the upper right-hand corner and I drag these to the left, you'll notice we split off and we actually get a second 3D editor, a 3D view. Now, we're not restricted to leaving these as 3D views. Every single one of these panels can be changed into anything. So I could make this a giant outliner using this little tiny menu here. I could make it a graph editor. I can make it a text editor. I have power to make this anything I need it to be. And this is true of all of the editors in here. So if I don't want a 3D view at all, I can make that into a dope sheet. I can take the timeline and I can make that into a graph editor. The interface is extremely customizable. So let's go ahead and set everything back. I'll go ahead and make this into a timeline. I'll make this into a 3D view. And now I have an extra view which is in my way. And if I want to get rid of that, I can just take those diagonal lines and drag over into the neighbor. And you'll get this little arrow that pops up. The arrow tells you which of these windows is going to collapse to make way for the other. So we put the arrow over on the right-hand side, let go, and boom, there we go. Okay, so that's just a really quick down and dirty breakdown of the native interface. Obviously, there's a lot more to this interface if you were to really start digging into Blender. Now, are there any questions at this point that I need to address? Somebody said, let's see, why would you want to split though? Well, Annie, if you're working with Blender, you may end up in a situation like, let's say you're animating, and this is something we'll probably end up doing today, where if we are trying to animate something in our scene, we might want to see what's going on in 3D view, and we would like to see our animation curves at the same time, in which case we might want to do something fancy like this. Now, a second ago, you saw me split from these diagonal lines in the upper right-hand corner, but we also have some in the lower left as well, and if I use these and drag up, we can split in this direction. And then I can take my lower editor and switch that over into a graph editor, like so. And now I've got my 3D view at the top, so I can watch all of my objects. And down here, all of my animation curves will be visible for me to edit. And that's something that we're going to be doing a little bit later. How do you undock one of these windows? Well, there's a couple of ways to go about it. One thing that I like to do, actually, is I will just duplicate a window. So I'll often just tap the spacebar and hit duplicate. And you can say duplicate area into new window. And right now I just made a 3D view that's floating. So I could drag that over to another monitor and have my very own viewport. And of course, just like every other editor, you can change this to anything you like. I'll go ahead and close that for now. So are there any other questions before I move on to some basic viewport navigation real quick? As I sip a little bit of water, because really, all this talking parches me out pretty quick. We will take a 5-minute break in just a moment. So for those of you who are jonesing for a break or a cigarette, don't worry, I've kept you in mind. I can use one too. But first, I do want to go over basic viewport navigation. Reason being, some of you will want to maybe practice this on your break if you are a total Blender noob, especially if you've come from other 3D applications and you're just not used to Blender's mode of navigation. So here they are real quick. Here inside your 3D view, to get around, you really need your middle mouse button. If you are not using a 3-button mouse, first thing, buy one. Please get a 3-button mouse. It will make your 3D animation life so much easier. However, if you're in a bind and you just can't get one, if you take a look inside your user preferences, there's a way to emulate a 3-button mouse, which is not something we're going to deal with right now. I'm going to assume that all of you have a mouse wheel or something you can click down and have a 3-button mouse. So if you click and drag with the middle mouse, you are tumbling the view around. Very simple. If you hold down the Shift button with your middle mouse, you are panning the view. So it's Shift and middle, and you can see that on my little screen tags there, screencast. If you hold down Control and middle mouse, you are zooming in and out, also known as dollying. Now, if you roll your mouse wheel forward and back, you can also zoom, which is pretty handy. So definitely keep that in mind. I use that more often than not. There's some other navigation features as well involving the Numpad, and that's that little block of numbers over on the right-hand side of your keyboard. If you don't have a Numpad, these can also be emulated over inside of your user preferences. And let's see, Wolf Knight said, should you be able to select all by clicking on nothing? No, you shouldn't. That means what you did is when you were setting up your hotkeys, you didn't change the action over to deselect. You left it at toggle. And so now when you click in space, it's going to select everything. Just so you know. Okay, so over on the Numpad, you have some very important features as well. If you hit the 1 key, you get a front view. If you hit the 3 key, you get a right view. Holding Control on either one of those gives you the opposite. So if you say 1, you'll notice you get the front. If you hold down Control and hit 1, you get the back. If you hit 3, you get the right, but if you hit Control 3, you get the left. So you can jump to either side. Now the cool thing about this, because I turned on auto perspective previously, this switches you over to a depthless orthographic view. So it's kind of like a blueprint or a diagram. And yeah, if you Iron Soldier said, I gotta go find my numpad. Yeah, if you got like a USB numpad, it's definitely worthwhile to use for Blender. Again, you can activate numpad emulation if you really, really need it, but that does get rid of your 1 through 0 keys, and that can be a little bit of a pain. So definitely, if you can, get a keyboard with a numpad if you want to really do some serious Blender work, or get one of those USB numpads. They're pretty cool. And please make sure you have a 3-button mouse, but that's true for all 3D applications. No matter which one you want to use, I think all of them make use of a middle mouse button at some point. Okay. So that's the 1 and 3 keys. If you hit 7, that'll take you to a top view. Control 7 will take you to a bottom view. So if you take a look at your numpad, that's kind of like in an L form. So you have 1, 3, and 7. The 5 key, dead center, is going to swap you between an orthographic and a perspective view. Of course, orthographic means you have no depth. Perspective means you do. So if you just need to switch that around, you can do that at will. Now, next, we have the 4 and 6 keys. Those are like arrow keys. They allow you to tumble around in increments. And if you hold down Control, they allow you to pan in increments. And 8 and 2 do the same thing, but vertically. So you can pan up and down. I'm sorry, you can tumble up and down, and you can pan up and down if you hit Control. Pretty straightforward. Now there's some other things as well that are pretty important to know about on your numpad. If you hit the 0 key, you are going to be looking through your actual camera. Blender is very good about dividing the view that you're looking through and the actual camera that you render through. So make sure you remember that what your render is going to see is what you see when you tap 0. If you're a Max person and you like the ability to snap your camera to whatever it is you happen to be looking at, you can do that with Control, Alt, 0. And that'll just jump you right over. That key combination is a little different on a Macintosh, I believe. And you'll have to forgive me, I do not remember what the key combination is. I have not used Blender on a Mac, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. Another really important button that you'll want to be able to use is to zoom in on something. So let me create something real quick. I'm going to create a piece of geometry. And this time, instead of going up to the Add menu, I'm going to hit Shift-A, and that'll bring up my Add menu right here where my mouse is. And let's just grab a cube, which is going to pop in at the location of the 3D cursor. I can hit the period key on my numpad, and what that'll do is fly me right over to that object. So I'm focused right up on it. That also works for components. So if you're working on a selected vertex, you can just tap the period key and that'll jump you right over to it nice and quick. And then the other one I wanted to show was if you hit the / key or like the divide symbol, this looks like it does the same thing. It looks like it snaps you right to the object, but this is a local view. All other objects are hidden, and you're only looking at this single object. If you tap it again, you're back out of local view, and all of your other objects remain. It's very handy if you have your view set up kind of where you want it, but you need to jump over to a specific object, do some work on it, and then jump back to where you were. An extremely useful feature. Aside from that, since we're still kind of looking at the numpad, of course, plus and minus are still going to zoom you in and out. So we'll just that's pretty straightforward and pretty basic, but really I think I only use my mouse wheel for that. So that is a quick breakdown of viewport navigation. Now, before we take a break, are there any questions about viewport navigation? I can go over it again really quick, but if you're completely new to Blender, you need to be practicing this. If you need to take some notes, of course, it'd be a good time to jot some stuff down. But eventually, I want you guys to not be thinking about viewport navigation. I want that to be second nature, so that if you see an object somewhere in your scene, and you're like, hey, I need to go look at that object, you just instinctively hit the button and fly over to it. What was the shortcut for local view again? Over on your numpad, that is the divide key. It doesn't work on the actual regular slash key. So remember that Blender is separating your numpad keys. So your numpad slash key will jump over to your local view. And I love that feature, and it's one of those things where you must understand, I'm a Maya person at heart, because I've been using Maya for the longest, and I really wish Maya had that feature. I could probably write a Mel script to make it, but, I'm lazy, and I just want everything that I like to just be there by default. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. So here's what I'm going to do. Oh, there's one more. There is a hotkey quick way to get back to perspective. Yes, tap the 5 key in the middle of your numpad, and that will take you between perspective and orthographic. Of course, if over in your user preferences you turned on auto perspective, unless you've manually switched on orthographic, actually even if you have, auto perspective will snap you out as soon as you start to rotate the view. And that is for the people who use Macs for years, Fat Gav, and realized that Max's whole ability to make orthographic user views was not only inferior but frustrating and stupid. Then you can turn on auto perspective, and that's the fix the stupid Max user view problem from way back. So are there, I just wanted to go ahead and poke people who are Max users because I think it's funny. So are there any other questions that I can answer real quick? And in the meantime, I'm going to do one more ready check. And this is who's ready for a break. And you can, of course, raise your hand over in the webinar if you're not using BuzzNet. And I'm just going to assume everybody's ready for a break. We're about to take one anyway, whether you're ready or not. So I'm about to pause the video, and we will take about a 5-minute break, give or take. And I will see you guys all when we get back. Of course, if you're watching this later on and it's being streamed to you, this is going to be an instantaneous thing. Feel free to pause the video and take a break of your own. All right, we are back from our break, and everybody is probably, well, hopefully you're hydrated and you've got your caffeine and or nicotine fix. So let's continue. Now, there were some questions when we went on break, and I wanted to make sure that all of those got addressed before moving on. And I do want to remind folks, I know it's hard. I know it's very tempting to make like commentary over in the question panel for the webinar, but please don't do that because you make it hard for me to scroll through and find questions. So let's see here. Somebody mentioned, if I scroll up just a little bit, somebody said, what do you have your FOV set to? Please, I'm just leaving it at default for now. It's not particularly important for us to change that at the moment. So whatever your native camera set to, which should be 35, we're just going to go ahead and leave it like that. Let's see. Somebody said, not related to 3D viewport, but how do I turn on and off the 3D manipulator via hotkey? That's with Control Spacebar. So if that little move tool that you see floating in your view is getting on your nerve for some reason, or you just don't want to use it, or for any other reason you want it to disappear, hit Control Spacebar, and it'll be gone. So there you go. Let's see, what else? What is the period key? Well, that's the button next to the 0 key on your numpad. Or at least I think it is. I don't know how it is on every single keyboard in the world. Let's see, next. I think that's all of the major questions. Oh, somebody said, did you talk about the 3D cursor yet? How do you move it with precision? Well, that's a really good question, and the answer is no, I haven't spoken about the 3D cursor yet, so let me squeeze that in real quick, the 3D cursor is your center of interest for your Blender scenes. It's always there, and if by default you have changed, if you're still using the default right-click to select keys, then left mouse is going to position your 3D cursor around. I reversed mine because I can't make my brain work well with having to select things with my right mouse button. So I will be placing the 3D cursor with the right mouse button instead. Now, what the 3D cursor is just a point in 3D space where you are drawing attention. So you can place this wherever you want, and then if you do something like add a new object, which I could hit Shift-A, and then add in something like an icosphere, you'll notice it pops in at the location of the 3D cursor. That's really what it's there for. And a lot of operations will make use of the 3D cursor as we move forward. If you want to place it with precision, there is a part of the 3D view specifically designed for the purpose. If we tap the N key, N as in November, if you take a look, there is a little group dedicated specifically to the 3D cursor. And this allows you to set this wherever you want it to be. And if I hit Tab key instead of caps lock, then that'll be a whole lot better. So we can set that back over to the origin. Alternatively, if you've placed it somewhere out in space, you can also hit Shift-S, and you have some places you can move the cursor. So you can move it to the selected object, you can move it to the center of the world, you can snap it to the grid, or take it to the active object. So just I could take it to center, and that puts it right back at the origin. So we are officially, I think we're pretty much done with our intro stuff at this point. I just had to squeeze in that stuff for the 3D cursor. And so now I believe we are ready to talk a little bit about our project.
If that's the case, would now be probably a good time to take a break?
We just got back from one.
Oh, okay. Never mind that.
I'm so sorry.
No, I've been downstairs on the phone with the GoToMeeting people now for the last 40 minutes, trying to see if they can figure out exactly what went wrong with their system.
Yeah.
And, of course, they cannot. And so...
Well, we could take a little... Do we need to take like a little baby mini break?
No, I was just going to update you, dear.
Okay.
But that's fine. No, so go ahead and continue.
All right. Well, it's time for us to talk a little bit about our project. And it's going to seem maybe a tiny teensy bit backwards the way I want to do this, but I want to actually start by showing you our end product. I want to show you what it is we're going for, and then we're going to move forward from there. So when you're doing projects on your own, it's highly unlikely you're going to have a render of any kind to look at. But here we go. So here's what we're going to be creating. And this is a pretty general render. I don't have anything fancy turned on like any of our special lighting stuff like ambient occlusion or any sort of bounce light or anything like that. It's just a basic render of the animation itself. And I'll play it one more time. In fact, I could probably just make it loop. So we got a little ball. He bounces up over a hill. He targets this little golf ball, takes a swing, and there we go. Knocks that thing off. He probably hooked it a little bit because he looks a little disappointed at the end. Did you notice that? He's lined up. I don't know why he put the tee up on top of this hill, but whack! And then he's kind of like, oh, man, I think I just messed that up. So this is what we're going to be creating. And let's see, we've got a couple of issues with lag. If that's the case, please do not fret. This is being recorded at a full 10 frames per second. You'll be able to go back and review any parts that get particularly laggy.
And that's just the nature of the beast when streaming live out there.
Yeah, it's going to happen, especially in moments of high motion. I might be able to make it a little better if I take my window, and this is total theory on my part. This may work, this may not work. If I hit play with a smaller window, it might be better. So, and whack, there we go. And I just keep wanting to put in sound effects whenever I watch that. While that's playing, somebody asked, is there a hotkey to toggle solid and wireframe display mode? Yeah, that's the Z key. So if you're working, you can just tap Z, and that'll switch over to wireframe. So this is what we're going to be creating. Now, the process for creating this is going to be kind of its own thing. Now, if you'll bear with me for just a minute, kind of sort of off the side, I'm going to open up a browser. And I'm going to go to a particular address that I've got set up that I will share with you guys so that you can watch all of these too if you want to open them up on your screen. For those of you,
Control-Shift-B as well.
Control-Shift-B. Yeah. There we go. And let me move this over here. Oh, it's too big.
Just maximize. Yeah.
There we go. And these are our storyboards. Now, I have uploaded all of these to the interwebs, and if you would like to open them up on your own, you can go to the interwebs at the following address, www.3dbuzz.com/Zach, because I'm kind of full of myself sometimes. Go under Blender 101 Storyboards, and then storyboards_1.png. Now, every time I pause, I am assuming you're putting a slash in there. So the whole thing is 3dbuzz.com/Blender101/storyboards/storyboards_1.png. Hopefully you've got all that. If not, it should be at the top of your screen right about now. So I want to talk a little bit about storyboarding. First off, I did something that I kind of did more for time concerns than anything else, and not something I ever assume you're going to do in your projects. I sort of combined the idea of concept art and storyboards into one cohesive unit because it allows us to get two things done at the same time. The idea of storyboards is a way for you to draft out how you want your animation to flow, almost like a comic book. You should be able to glance at your storyboards and get a really general idea of how your animation is going to be flowing. Somebody said scheduled maintenance. If it says scheduled maintenance, you typed the address in wrong. There's just no other way about it. Make sure you put the www in there, too, just to be safe. Just really quick, is there anybody who can't locate the storyboard file that I've got open? Please pay attention to the address at the top of the bar. Make sure you have it in right. Soganatsu. I said, how do we hide the 3D cursor because it's ugly and annoying? I've never hidden the 3D cursor inside of Blender because so many operations are dependent on it. You won't want to hide it. You'll just want to get used to it. And yeah, now you can over inside of your viewport, if you hit the N key, N as in November, under the display settings, there's something that says render only, and that will hide in anything that's not going to render, and you can try that, but other than that. So I got some hands popping up. Is there anybody who is having problems seeing these, the storyboard? I'm going to do a quick ready check just to make sure that everybody can view these storyboards. Please raise your hand if you can't see them. Yeah, if you can't see them, raise your hand. It looks like it. Okay, so good. Most people are finding them. So the folks who are having problems, they just typed it in wrong, and I think we've established that. Okay, so again, the idea of storyboards is just a way for you to get an idea of how your animation is going to flow, what it's going to look like. It's also a good way to help you lock down your camera. And something that I like to stress when people are just getting into animation is the importance of locking down your camera early. The reason being is that a lot of your work that you create, you can build with the camera in mind. If you have, let's say, I'm going to assume most of you who are wanting to get into Blender at some point want to do a great big spaceship battle scene, the likes of which you probably saw at the beginning of Star Wars Episode 3. You want big starships, and you want little tiny ships flying around. You want lasers and explosions and moons and planets and things. Anytime you're doing a huge scene like this, it's a good idea to know where the camera's going to be because you might end up building this gigantic starship that's got all this greebling and all these bits and pieces and parts, and you might only ever be looking at it from the left-hand side in this one shot. Well, if that's the case, why would you spend time and bandwidth modeling the right-hand side and making that look all pretty? So if you lock down the camera early on in a project, you have a clearer idea of what you should be working on and things that you can skip for sake of time to keep your project on time, to keep you from doing work that's never going to be noticed. It just makes things easier. So in this case, I have a pretty good idea of what I want my camera to be looking at. I want a hill, I want a little golf ball, and I want a sky in the background. Now, all of that said, the view that you see here in my storyboards is going to be pretty over-rendered as far as I'm concerned. I've overdrawn these. I've made them look a lot prettier than they need to be. Do not let this intimidate you. A storyboard doesn't have to look very good at all. As long as you can understand it, and as long as it gets the point across for what you're going to be doing, then you should be good to go. If you are... I'm sorry, I noticed a question and it kind of distracted me. If you are not very artistically inclined, stick figures and little circles and squares will definitely get you through. The only thing is if you're working on a team, make sure your team can understand what it is you're doing. So here we go with our first storyboard. It says, static camera on a bright, clear day. Golf ball can be seen close to camera left center. I kind of wanted everything to be set up in such a way, compositioned in such a way, where our ball was pretty much going to be slightly off to the side. Now, I did kind of, in my head, I didn't draw these, but I did sort of divide this pane up into the rule of thirds, and I made sure to have my golf ball pretty close to the intersection of those third lines. It just makes, it gives it a little bit of importance in terms of overall composition. So now, we can switch over to Storyboard 2. So you can just change the 2 at the end of the file name, or sorry, change the 1 over to a 2, and this will take you to your next one. So our character bounces into view from camera right up over the hill. Now, a thing about this is I am not a real stickler for whatever gets written. I jot myself down some really generic notes whenever I make storyboards. And in this case, I wanted to go ahead and write down how I envisioned the bounce cycle taking place. So 3 quick bounces, around 3 seconds, because I'm picturing these being about a 1 second each bounce. So he's going to kind of get up in the air and kind of loft up in there. He'll float just a little. So it won't be like a super realistic bounce. It'll have a bit of a toony feel where he's up in the air for like a full second and then comes down and bounces up again. I'll go ahead and switch over to storyboard number 3. So our next one, he's up at the top of the hill and he's settling in. He's getting ready to do his thing. And I was thinking maybe we could put a little bit of jiggle in here. And you'll notice that I'm giving myself these little time indications of about how long I think each one of these should take. And I always try to put the little tilde sign in there. And that just reminds me, I'm thinking this should be about a second. Because something that I find with storyboards when you're working on them is that sometimes you're just not right. You'll get close to something, you'll think this should be 3 seconds, 4 seconds, however long it is, and then you animate it out to that, and you'll find that it needs some adjustment. Maybe it needs to be just a tad longer, maybe it needs to be just a tad shorter. You need some kind of adjustment. So just as a reminder to give myself permission to be flexible, I always put that little squiggly in there. It makes me feel better, and I think sometimes that's important. All right, next one. So he moves his club into position for the swing, so that should be a relatively quick thing. Not much to talk about, really. He's going to draw back, and I want him to draw back and kind of hold this, so a little bit of exaggeration. Because, some golfers, if you watch people play golf, they don't hold it at all. It's like draw back, slam, and it's just like this really quick thing. But I want him to kind of draw back and hold it for just a minute, so there's a little bit of artistic buildup. And then he cracks the ball. So rapid swing, ball goes sailing off camera right, and that should be a really fast thing. So that's less than a second. And that's just going to be dependent on, once I get everything tweaked out, how I feel that's going, how long I think it needs to be, and so on and so forth. Now that's it. Those are all 6 of our storyboards. If you try to continue on to 7, you're going to get this. It's going to say you're down for maintenance, which is basically our 404 page, if you're unfamiliar. So that is our rundown of the storyboards. Real quick, if I just back up. So we start with 1, and the ball bounces up over the hill. And there's up the top of the hill, club in place, draws back, swings. That's it. It's actually a pretty simple thing. Annie just asked, is there a reference out there for timing based on movement? You are your best reference for timing based on movement. This is something I wanted to talk about next, and you gave me a fantastic segue, so that's awesome. When you are figuring out timing for stuff, don't be scared to act stuff out. One of the things about being an animator is you cannot be afraid to look kind of foolish. Every animator I know at some point has been in a room doing something that to normal passersby will be like, are they crazy? Because they'll be sitting there at their desk with a Coke can or a tennis ball or something, and they'll just be like, it's like they're playing pretend. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're just kind of visualizing how motion is going to work and what it should look like. Now, if you're looking for precise figures, go buy a stopwatch. Or maybe you've got a smartphone that's got a stopwatch app that's more than adequate. But generally, I would even then, I would advise you to go buy a cheap $5 stopwatch at your local general store. so that you could lose it if you really, really wanted to, and then go act something out. If you want to know how long it's going to take for your character to cross the room, stand up, cross the room, and time it, and then you'll have a solid idea. And Ed Ramsey also mentioned my next point, which is that video reference is also very important for animation. Now, in this case, I understand you're going to be hard pressed to find a video of a ball bouncing up over a hill to get a golf ball, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't take some video footage of a tennis ball bouncing just to get a really solid feel for how that bounce looks. What kind of arcs of motion do you get? Now, in our case, we're going to be faking it because instead of just letting our ball technically bounce up a hill, we're going to breathe a little bit of life into him with a character rig. We're going to give him some squash and some stretch. We're going to make him bend a little bit. And he's going to go from just bouncing up a hill to actually looking like he's jumping. He's going to have a little bit of life, which you saw in our video earlier. Which I'm going to make, hang on, let me pause that. I don't want to play that full size because I realize that lags some people off into oblivion. So I'll make this nice and small. And so you can see, I mean, you can see him kind of, he's like bracing himself and he's getting ready to go with each bounce. He's really kind of driving himself up off the ground. So he's going from a bounce to a jump. And because of that, then we've got to kind of change how we feel about his overall motion. It's no longer so much a bounce as it is an active character, a living, breathing thing exerting force on himself and his environment to make it through the scene. So go ahead and close that. Okay, so are there any questions so far about our storyboards or anything that's going on? So I do want to mention, just kind of as an aside, and it actually causes me to want to bring this up one more time, but I will leave these full screen, and I'm just going to pick a frame. Actually, this frame is fine for what I've got in mind, even though it does kind of hide the club perfectly behind our character's head. There is a lot going on here that we're going to be talking about, and a lot more than it may look like at first, because we've got things like, you might notice we've got a little bit of shadowing going on around the cap, around the character. We're going to be doing some texture baking. Of course, he's got probably the coolest shirt ever for a ball to be wearing. I actually wish I had this shirt. So we're going to talk about how to model that and, of course, get that properly textured. We've got some things going on. Well, actually, somebody just said in the chat, is there a particle effect going on? Actually, there's two particle effects. We've got some grass that's being thrown up into the air, and then we've got some grass that's, this is also a particle effect that's growing up over the hill, and we're going to be taking a look at that too. But see, the reason I point this out is that sometimes if you really take some time to draw out your scene, if you spend a little bit of extra effort on things like storyboards and concept art, then it can give you a clearer idea of what you'll end up having to accomplish for your animation. So in this case, I knew that I wanted to be at the top of a grassy hill. Boom, we're going to have to do some sort of a grass or hairish sort of particle effect. We know that. We want the little character here who has no arms to be able to look like he's naturally swinging a golf club. Now, if you are completely new to animation, then I'll kind of just share a quick thing with you. Moving an object by hand such that it flies through space in a perfect arc is a very tricky thing. It's kind of like drawing a perfect circle over time. And so, you know, that already gives us an idea of the kind of concerns we're going to need for a possible character rig to help us animate this golf club. We see things like squash and stretch. Obviously, he's not a perfect ball right now. He's stretched up into the air. And so we realize that we're going to need some sort of, you know, squashy, stretchy apparatus, and we don't want to do that necessarily by squashing and stretching the actual object. We want some kind of a rig, something to simplify the process of moving and stretching our character out. So by really taking time to think about how your storyboards look shot to shot, you can start to infer a lot of things you're going to need to handle in your animation. So keep that in mind. And yes, guys, this is a pant shirt. It's the hard-boiled egg-style pant shirt that you may have heard about in all the fashion scenes. Okay, so with that, we've got a rundown of what we need to accomplish for our scene. We've taken a look at our storyboards. I'm assuming right now there aren't any particular questions about the storyboards or about the project or anything we're going to be that you may have seen up to this point. If there are, now would be a good time to throw those out. So if there's anything actually in the video that you see that makes you curious, because this is Pretty much exactly what we're going to be creating. In fact, what we create will end up looking a little better than this because due to time constraints on the render, I wasn't able to turn on all of the fancy little rendering tricks that I normally like to do in a final render. I just didn't have the time for it. So if there are any questions at all, here's a really good one. Dave Stewart asks, how many storyboards should you have? You know, there is no set number for that. I like the idea of keeping things as simple as I can. Some folks will really go overboard and almost have what feels to me like a flip book, but there's no right or wrong answer to that. If you can look at your storyboards, and if you only had 2 storyboards, but they just by looking at those, you feel that you've got a really good sense of timing for the sequence that you're creating, then you're set to go. You don't need to do anything else. Now, if on the other hand, you look at your 2 storyboards and, I don't know, something just doesn't feel locked down to you. You don't have a solid sense of timing. You don't really know where the camera's going to be. You're not sure how your character is going to be moving around in the scene. It may be time to sit down and draft a couple more or rethink your approach to your storyboarding. So there's no solid yes or no to storyboards in general. There is no you should have this or you should have this many or that many. Can we do a modification tutorial after this? I wanted to smash the camera with a glass effect. That's a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about right now. But I mean, it's definitely something to consider. Is it possible to download the final video so we can have a better look at it? That's a really good question, and I only finished rendering and compiling this like earlier this morning, so I haven't had time to upload it, but I will do that. I will make sure that it is, and please pay attention to this. I'll make a post to remind you, but jot this down. I will put this over in the member sponsor video download section, so if you look over in the member sponsor lounge, which I guess I can go ahead and point it out for those who need it. So here's a browser. If you go over to the Member Sponsor Lounge, at the very top among the stickies, there are the streaming video support files, which you can only access, of course, if you are a member sponsor. The very first post has the following link. And I will see that video gets put inside of here, and basically there will be a brand new area that will be probably Blender 101, or I could just put it under the Blender section, and that'll be fine. So, no problem there, just so everybody knows where that's going to be, and you will be able to download that final video. I do want to stress, though, for those of you who do end up grabbing that, again, it's not, I don't even want to call it the final video. That doesn't seem right to me, because there are definitely some things that I would clean up and tweak about it, in particular in terms of the lighting and the rendering, but it was a nice way to get across what we're going to be attacking and what we're going to be creating inside this project. Okay, so without any other questions from there, I think it's probably a good time for us to go ahead and get started setting up our project. So I'll go ahead and kill out my storyboards. And let's see, let's close this out. And over inside of Blender, the very first thing I'm going to do is go to File and click New. And because I set up my settings earlier to get rid of all excess geometry, then all I get is a nice scene with just a camera and a light in it, which to me is pretty convenient. Now, something I like to do first thing is immediately go to File and hit Save. And this is going to bring up your nice little save window. If I know I'm working on a project, I like to create a very simple folder structure. Now, depending on the level of my project, sometimes it's not so simple, to be honest. But let's go ahead and start here. We're going to create a brand new directory. And I'm going to name this, let's see, Talented Golf Ball, I guess. We'll open this up, and we're going to call this golf scene _1. Whatever works for you. There really is no hardcore naming convention. My whole thing about naming conventions is pick one. It doesn't matter what it is. Just stick to it. Be consistent with your naming convention, and then everything will be fine. Everything will kind of go from there. So go ahead and save the Blender file. Always, 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 always do that first, so that you can just hit Control-S when you want to, and you're all ready to go at any time. Now, a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that under my render settings, which is over in the Properties view on the right-hand side, I'm going to click on the little camera icon to make sure I am under render settings. Down under Dimensions, I'm going to set my frame rate to 30 frames per second. Now also, over in the timeline, we have a start time and an end time. We will be adjusting this, but first we're going to end up building our scene. So I just want to make note that our animation will not be 250 frames long. As a matter of fact, actually, the one that you just saw rendered was about 370. Most of the hardcore bits of animation only exist within about a 100 frame area, and that's just getting the ball to bounce up over the hill. Everything else is actually really straightforward and kind of descends from that. Okay, so let's start by building our scene. Now, if we think back to our storyboards, I'm not going to call them back up, and hopefully you've downloaded them. Please feel free to download the storyboards if you like. You'll find they're pretty big, and you could print them if you wanted to. We're going to need to create that landscape, our hill. Now, there's a couple of ways to go about adding geometry into a scene. There is the I'm a complete noob to Blender, and I'm a little scared to do anything other than what's on the interface, and I say that with nothing but love. And you can click on the Add menu, go over to Mesh, and drop in a plane. Alternatively, and you've already seen me do this a couple of times in the video, hit Shift-A, and that's going to bring up that Add menu right at the location of your mouse, which is pretty handy. And go ahead and drop in a plane. And Captain Bakeniko already had a Blender crash. That's just failure, Captain. All right, so once you have your plane in, we need to make this big enough to actually fill up our scene. So we're going to scale this up. Tap the S key, S for scale. And of course, you can waggle your mouse around and make this around the size of the grid if you like. What we're going to do instead, though, is just tap the 8 key. And you can do that on the number pad or in the numbers across the top of your view. And that will set this to a scale of 8 in all 3 axes, which fills up the grid pretty nicely. So make sure you create a plane, scale it up by 8, and then we'll move forward. I'll give everybody just a second to do that, though. It should be a pretty quick thing, unless Blender's crashing on you. And if Blender is crashing on you, then I'm sorry. All right, the next thing I'm going to do, and this is purely, this is just me more than it is anything else. I'm going to take my grid, and I've got my manipulator visible here in the view. If you don't, you can hit Control Space to make it visible. I'm just going to nudge this up a little bit. I actually want to keep my grid in the view, just in case I need it for anything, especially like if I go to wireframe view, which I can do with the Z key or the Z key. But I don't want to see that grid while I'm working on this plane. So if I nudge it up just like a fraction of a unit, it hides the grid away, and to me that's just very nice. Okay, once you have your plane all sized up and ready to go, we're going to tap the W key. Actually, I'm sorry, we need to go into edit mode first. Let me tap the tab key first to go into edit mode. Now, we're automatically going to have this guy selected, but I just for sake of cleanliness, I'm going to select faces. Let's hit Control-Tab and switch over to face. So you could just hit Control-Tab F if you like. And if you are trying to hide the grid, honestly, right off the top of my head, I do not recall the hotkey, but you can go under Display and you can turn the grid floor on and off if you like. And that's if you tap the N key, N is in November, to open up your little properties area inside the 3D view. And I do want to mention this, it will get on your nerves. There is the properties editor, which is the great big column of stuff over here. And if you tap the N key inside your 3D view, there's a little properties area, and they both are called properties. You just have to get used to that. It can be a little frustrating if you're reading tutorials over Blender and somebody says the properties area or the properties editor, properties view. Sometimes they'll just say, go to properties and add a constraint. And you have to know that you add constraints in the properties editor and not inside the little properties view inside the 3D view. So it's just one of those things to be aware of. Okay, once you have your faces active, make sure you have this face selected. You'll know if you do because it gets all highlighted in orange. We're going to tap W, and the very first entry at the top of the list when you hit the W key, and that's for your specials menu, is Subdivide. So it's going to add some cuts. So we now have 4 individual polygons for our little plane here. Of course, we need a lot more than just 4. So what I'm going to do is change this. We have 2 different places we can do this. If you cut your eyes to the left and look over inside the toolbox, you have a number of cuts that you can increase. And you can just march this up all the way up to 10. 10 is as high as it wants you to go by default. So go ahead and leave that back down at 1 because there's another way to do this. Whatever operation you have just completed inside of Blender. So in this case, we just did a subdivide operation. You can tap the F6 key, and this will open up the same window at the location of your mouse. Now, why is that cool? Well, if for some reason you don't have your toolbox open, like you've hit the T key and you don't see it, or maybe you've hit, and I'm getting fancy, everybody be ready. If you hit Control and the up arrow key, so all you have is one giant viewport, then you might not see any of this stuff, so you can just tap F6 and you have the settings for your last command, which is pretty fancy. How did you just do that subdivide? Tap the W key to bring up your specials menu, and at the very top, you'll see subdivide. Now I want to show you guys something else too. If I hit Control Z, and that just undid my subdivide, something else you can do is if you know the name of the command, or you have a general idea of the name of the command, use the spacebar. It probably is the handiest feature inside of Blender. So if you know that I did subdivide, but you don't know how I did it, you can tap spacebar and just start typing subdivide, and there it is, right there. So you could just call it just like that if you wanted to. Now, of course, that's just one way to go about it. The way we've been doing it, and we're going to do it, is with the W key. Okay, so now I'm going to press F6, and I'm going to increase this all the way up to a whopping 10 cuts. Now, why am I dividing this so much? Well, I've got to add some curvature to this here in just a minute. And if you need curvature, you need more detail. It's just how it works. Just move our mouse away, and that's already committed. Now, if we'd like to do another subdivide, which I need just a little more than what we have here, I'm not going to worry too much about adding smoothing at this stage of the game, though I suppose we could. Let's hit the W key one more time, and I just want to point out, if you subdivide again, I guess if you're running a slower system, you could have just crashed Blender, and if you did, my apologies. But what happened is you subdivided to another increment of 10. It maintained that setting, so make sure you press F6, and this time I'm going to set this back down to 1, and I want to show you something. Instead of just clicking your arrows, or instead of clicking on the number and punching in a number like 1 or 5 or anything like that, and you can manually punch it in higher than 10, I guess it's good to point out too, just obviously be very careful about doing that. You can click and drag this, so it's like a slider like you would find over inside of 3ds Max, Gav. So I'm just going to drag that down. So I'm going to add one more division. So it's basically 10 plus 1 to give me just the exact amount of detail that I want to create my little hill. Now, the cool thing about this is this odd number of subdivisions gives me a point right in the middle of my my plane. If you have an even number of divisions, so you're not following along exactly, you might have a face right in the middle, which is fine. Whichever works for you is okay. But I'm going to switch over to vertices. So it can, Control Tab, V for vertex. So I'm going to be calling those out as best I can, and it looks like, am I crazy? Hang on. I mean, I
could answer that for you without even knowing what you're.
Yeah, my screencast keys went away, so let me go ahead and make sure those get switched back on. So we'll jump over to add-ons. Oh, you know what? I think they're just turned off. So N. Yep, start display. Okay, so I'll turn those back on. Sorry, those got switched off a second ago. And did I just nuke Blender? I did.
Captain Guy, your turn to tell Zach he failed.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to send information to anybody. And this is not the blue screen of death. This is actually Photoshop, so please don't be alarmed.
That or the blue screen failed itself.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, the blue screen crashed. That'd be the best. Okay, so screencast keys are back on. I didn't think screencast would kill Blender, but that's okay. This allows me to just do all that stuff over again. So we'll tap Shift-A to add a plane. We'll hit S to scale and just tap the 8 key. I will nudge this up into the air very slightly just to hide my grid away temporarily. I will hit Tab to go into edit mode, and then Control Tab to switch over to faces. I'm going to hit W and choose Subdivide from the menu. Press F6 and drag this up to 10. In fact, if I wanted to be all fancy, I could just punch in 11 and press Enter. But the interesting thing about doing it this way, if I do 10 first, and then I divide again, so hit W, subdivide, and just set that back over, then I get exactly what I want, just like so.
So you can go ahead and just hit the ready reset if people are following along, make sure everybody is.
Yeah, make sure everybody got that. So does everybody have a subdivided plane in the middle of their view now? And hopefully the answer is a resounding yes. This may be redundant, but will this video be available for us to watch, and where will it be? And Annie, I'm happy everybody's here and asking questions, but I feel like I've answered that question like a million times this week. We're recording all of these sessions, and if you take a look over on 3D Buzz at the very top of the website, there is a link to live classes. This will take you to a simple calendar page, and if you take a look at the calendar entry for today's date, once this gets encoded and uploaded, you'll see a view link, which will take you right to it. We're also going to be making a view link over inside the Member Sponsor Lounge in the thread. So there will be all kinds of ways to get over to this. No, there's not really a difference between subdividing with faces instead of vertices.
Make sure to read the question.
I'm sorry, yeah, the question. Jazz McDaniel said, is there a difference between subdividing with faces instead of vertices? And the answer is no. And somebody said, I can't find the specials menu in the interface, and W is set to move. Thank heaven for Spacebar. Yeah, that's what's going to happen if you're not using the default Blender hotkeys, which is one of the big reasons why I decided to use the default Blender hotkeys. So your mileage may vary. If you have your own custom key layout, I can't be responsible for that. So, Gav. And I only did that because Gav asked the question, and we love Gav around here. Okay, so somebody asked, is there a break soon? Not for just a little bit. Please bear with me. Let's get our scene built, and then we'll take a quick break before we build our animation, okay? So everybody should have a subdivided plane. What we're going to do now is just select the single point or face, whichever you happen to have, that is dead in the center of your view. And we're going to pull this up into the air. So now I have my manipulator showing. You don't necessarily have to have your manipulator. So I'm obviously with it, it's easy to just drag this up into the air. But alternatively, if it was hidden, you could tap the G key. Now the problem with G is natively you're moving in screen space. And if you don't want to do that, middle mouse drag to constrain that down to the Z axis, then let go of middle mouse. And now you're only moving along Z. I'm going to pull this up into the air about 3.5 units. This is not an exact science, and it doesn't need to be, but 3.5 should get you pretty much where you want to go. And just make a little tiny point. Now, how do you turn grid snapping off? I seem to be stuck working in increments of 1. You probably, I believe it's Shift-Tab turns that on and off, or there's a little tiny magnet icon down here in your 3D view, which you probably just switched on. I'm going to guess you went to hit Control-Tab to change your components, and you hit Shift-Tab instead. It's happened to me like 1,000,004 times. And somebody said, select all, please. That would be the A key by default. And forgive me if I don't read your names right off the bat. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Anyway, so we have this single point, which doesn't look very hill-like, and obviously that's a problem. But just like when we did our subdivide, the settings for our last command are held and ready for us to alter. So you can cut your eyes over to the toolbox and make some changes, or what I'm going to do is just press F6 again. And what I'm going to do is turn on proportional editing. Now, this is something we could have turned on in advance, but I like doing it this way for specific movements. Like in this case, I know I want to make a very particularly shaped hill, but I don't want to have to deal with rolling my mouse wheel or adjusting the size, etc., and so forth. So what I'm going to do is turn on proportional editing after the fact. Make sure you set this to enabled and not connected, and I'll show you why here in just a moment. You can just increase the proportional size, and I'm just dragging with my mouse wheel, and get something that is hill-like and looks satisfying to you. I like seeing it go pretty much out to the edges of the grid, so that in my case that's at about 8.29 as your radius. And there you go. You have a hill. Now I want to point something out. If I hit the Tab key, and I'm going to smooth shade this. This is done over in my toolbox. There's a smooth shading button I'm just going to click on. And I just want to tumble around this. You see this is all very, very smooth. Now I'm going to undo, make everything flat again, go back into Edit View. Now I'm just demonstrating something, okay? And I lost my subdivisions real quick, so let me go ahead and add those back in. The reason I lost them is because Blender has a couple of different undo cues. It has a separate undo cue for object mode and for edit mode. So by undoing while I was in object mode, I undid a little bit further than I meant to, which is fine, because subdividing is really a very quick and easy thing. Okay, so now if I grab this guy again, and I pull him up into the air, just like before. So again, we'll go to about 3.5 units.
and I press F6, if I set my proportional editing to connected, things look pretty much the same, but there's a really subtle difference. What this is doing is this is using the distance of edges to figure out how far out you should go as opposed to a true 3D radius. It still gives you a hill, but... And if I smooth this out, it becomes a lot more apparent. So again, I'm going to click smooth over in the toolbox. You get these funny little lines and creases coming out of it. So if you've created a hill and you get these weird, funny little lines and creases coming out of it, it's because you use connected instead of enabled. So I'm going to undo one more time. Actually, let me redo. Switch over to edit mode and then undo, and then that keeps everything. So we'll drag that back up one last time. I just wanted to point that out. So if any of you are experiencing that problem, and you're like, my hill doesn't look right. Now you know why it doesn't look right. And we'll drag that back out to about 8 something. Again, not an exact science and doesn't really need to be. So with that, you should have a hill. Now, I just jumped back out to object mode by tapping the tab key. Once you are done doing that, and so are you looking at questions? How do you do the hill again? Well, let's see here. Couple of things. Let me do the hill one more time, all right? Just to make sure everybody's completely on the level. I'm just going to delete the whole thing, and we'll start over again. So watch very closely. We're going to go to Add, which you can do through the menu at the top of your screen, or conversely, you can do through Shift-A, and we'll add a plane. I'm going to scale that up by a factor of 8, so tap the S key and hit the 8 key. Press Enter. Nudge that up just a little bit, and that just hides my grid. That's just a personal preference. Tab to go into edit mode. W to subdivide. Then F6 to change the number of cuts, which I could just do 11, but I didn't. I'm going to subdivide one more time and set that down to 1 to get my 11th cut, and there we go. Now, Soganatsu, you said, okay, this is not happening for me. More details would probably be good. And Dave Stewart just said, I can't use F6 as I deselected. How do I move more vertices? Well, that's the funny thing about the F6 command. What that does, basically, is it calls up what happened with your last command. In your case now, the last command was simply undoing. So you're going to have to be a little bit more careful. My quick response would be just to go ahead and undo that action and just bring it back up again. You can't make it smooth out, basically, okay? And that's Saganatsu's still having some issues. My proportional editing disables when I move a vertex. Well, that's going to depend if you can have it switched on from the start. And in this case, it's so big that it's moving everything. The trick here, though, is as you're moving, you need to use the mouse wheel to control your proportional size. And I just have never really been a particularly big fan of doing that, unless I know what's going on. Showing menu keys would also be helpful. I'm very mouse focused. Thanks. Oh, hang on just a moment, folks. One thing at a time here. Let me click over here like so. Now, again, all I'm going to do, and let me turn off proportional editing. I want you guys to start this off without proportional editing. Just move a single point up, 3.5 units, like so. Then, as soon as you've done that, do not deselect, do not click anything. Then press F6. And then you can enable proportional editing and adjust your proportional size, like so. So what I'm going to do, and there is a redo hotkey. Somebody just asked, is there a redo hotkey? That's going to be Control-Shift-Z, just like Photoshop if you're a Photoshop user. Now I'm going to do another quick ready check. So I want everybody to tell me if they've got a hill. And of course, you can raise your hand if you've got a hill. If you still have any problems creating a hill, please ask a question. And I'm getting a few readies coming in. Some folks are still working. And I'm just kind of waiting for responses to come in. Excuse me. But I'm not getting any new questions. And let's see. Note on BuzzNet, have to click the flag 4 or 5 times before it takes. Sometimes that happens. And we're really sorry about that. We'll look into it. How do I change the radius thing you did? Well, if you're doing it after the fact like I did, once you press F6 here inside your view, you'll see that you have proportional size and you can adjust that. if you're trying to do it while you actually make an edit, which you can do, if you turn on proportional editing with the O key, then you can start to move an object up and then scroll the mouse wheel while you are moving. And you'll notice in the 3D view at the bottom that it's actually feeding back the proportional size that you're using right now. So I hope that answers your question. All right, and folks are starting to come along. We're getting a lot more readies now, but some folks are still needing a minute, so I'm just going to give people just a bit. Could these values be animated? No, these are actually tools that we're using. Let's see. Somebody says, I can't even select the vertex. Jesse, are you in edit mode? That would be the first thing. And then do you have vertices as your active component? If you don't, you're going to need to make sure that you hit Control, Tab, and choose Vertex from Mesh Select mode. And then you should be able to select your vertices. All right, Lee Dalton says, sorry, it's not smoothing out like yours. I've got a massive straight point and a very slight smoothing around it, no matter how high I set the smoothing. Okay, something that you may have done, and I mean, I'm kind of brainstorming to try to figure out exactly what could be going on, but if I turn off proportional editing, you could have done something kind of like this, where you had a point, and then maybe you nudged that point just a tiny little bit, and then you started adjusting your smoothing. In which case, so let me make sure I enable it first, you're not going to get much of a result. So what you're going to need to do is make sure that you start with a completely flat plane, make only one motion to move this up to about 3.5 units, then press F6, enable, and then adjust your proportional size accordingly. So make sure you do it all in one thing. You have that correct, but it's not working for you. This is Jesse still having a hard time selecting vertices. Let's see. Oh, you got it now. Okay. Well, that's good. And we're getting more and more ready. Some folks still needing a minute. Folks, I do apologize if BuzzNet is feeling a little bit laggy. It is something that we're still working on. It is still very much a alpha or beta level application at the moment.
As a matter of fact, Nelson's not around. I have no idea why it's even flashing at the moment.
Yeah. Somebody did say, how can I modify the height of the hill after I've created it and deselected? You would need to make an entirely new motion. So, for instance, I could grab the hill, and I could take my 1 point just like I did before. And like I say, if I want my hill to be a little taller, I could pull this 1 point up and do the same thing. Just go back into F6. Make sure I don't move my mouse outside that window. Re-enable proportional editing, and then just go from there. Now, something else that is very, very interesting is you can also change your vector. And what this is this kind of gives you the delta of that motion. So right now, we moved that point 1.232 units straight up. I can change that in here. So I can make it higher or lower and basically redo the motion right here inside this window. Robert Preston says, F6 is ignoring me. What have I done wrong? Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what you've done wrong. It's possible that your hotkeys have been changed around a little bit. It's possible that there's some sort of bug or malfunction. But it doesn't matter that much, because even if you don't have F6 working, you can go over to your toolbox, which if it's not visible, that's the T key over here inside of your 3D view. And at the very bottom of the toolbox is going to be the exact same information that I'm accessing through F6. It's just going to be over there on the side of your interface and not necessarily in a pop-up window. So more than one way to skin a cat. And let's see, Wolf Nightly said, I don't have just one face in the middle. It doesn't really matter. All you need is some point very much near the center. If it's off by a little bit, that's okay. Again, this is not an exact science. Maybe you could mention that on Mac it takes function plus F6. I could mention that. I did mention early on I am not a Blender Mac user, and so I do apologize in advance to all of you Mac users out there who are inconvenienced by the fact that I don't have all of the nuances of the Macintosh hotkeys right off the top of my head. But I still love you. I really do. It's true. Okay, so what do we set proportional size to again? Again, I just want to mention, not an exact science. Mine is somewhere around 8. I think it's like at 8.2, but your mileage may vary. I'm going to try to encourage you at all times to don't be too scared to have slightly different values than me. It probably is not going to kill you. And even if it does start to get you confused, honestly, I know this may sound a little ruthless, but digging your way out of that confusion is going to teach you something. If you hit the wrong button and you have to spend 10 minutes digging out, I know this sounds ruthless, but you'll probably never make that mistake again. You'll walk away with that information for the rest of your life.
Unless you're hard-headed like me.
Or me, but we're going to assume you're not. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of readies now, and folks are starting to raise their hands, so I think we're pretty much ready to move on to the next bit. What I'd like to do real quick is create our character. And then I promise we're going to take a quick break after we get everything already built into the scene, okay? So, first thing, I guess we could build this right at the location of the 3D cursor. It doesn't really matter where we build it, because we're going to be moving it around anyway. So what I want everybody to do is hit the tab key to make sure you're in object mode and not edit mode. And if you need to, tap the smooth button, which is located in your toolbox. Once again, press the T key to show your toolbox if you need to. Just tap smooth, and that's just going to get rid of those extra facets on your hill. You don't have to do that, it just looks nice. Now, we're going to add in a sphere. So I'm going to hit Shift A to bring up that menu. Of course, you can just go to the Add menu at the top of your view and create a UV sphere, not an icosphere, but a UV sphere. Just to make sure everybody is very clear with that. We're going to leave his settings at default. So we're not going to change segments or rings or anything. Just go ahead and leave it right where it is. We're going to be changing actually, in this case, we're not going to change anything. This is just a temporary piece of geometry we're going to use for animatics. So once you have that in, we need to go ahead and move this to its new location. Now, by default, this sphere has a radius of 1. Now, if a sphere has a radius of 1, then how tall is it? It's 2. Twice the radius. So what we're going to do is move this about 1 unit up into the air. Now, I just did that by dragging the little blue arrow of my Move Manipulator. If you don't see your Move Manipulator, you can hit Control Spacebar to show it. And of course, just as another mention, you can tap the G key and then middle mouse drag to select your Z-axis, whatever you like. The point is, you want to set this ball pretty much right on top of the grid. Once you've got it set on top of the grid, it's time to make a very important decision. So please pay attention to what I'm about to say. You want to choose what direction is forward in your scene. And this is often overlooked by folks who are just getting into 3D. Somebody said, do we need to make our hill a little extra high like you did? No, you don't. And I'll probably end up squashing mine back down to 3.5 units at some point. But you don't need to follow along. As I mentioned, the building of the hill, all of that is very inexact science. Okay, so once you've got your sphere sitting on top of the grid, I am going to assume that Y is forward. So the x-axis is going to move us left and right, the y-axis is going to move our character forward, and the z-axis is straight up into the air. Please keep that in mind. So what I'll do is take the y-axis and drag backwards, which in my case is off to the right. It may not be right for you, depending on what side of the view you've rotated around to. So to make things easy on everybody, I'm going to tap the 3 key on my numpad to give us a right orthographic view, and then just drag your sphere off to the left side of the grid. So he should be pretty much right at the base of your hill. And again, that's with the right view, and I went over to that using the 3 key on my numpad. Now, while you guys are doing that real quick, I am going to jump here into edit mode, tap undo once, and that'll just take me back down to my shorter hill, go back out of edit mode one more time and smooth things out. So there's no confusion on how tall your hill should be, which doesn't matter. Your hill can be as tall as you like it to be. It could be a pit if you want. It could be like in a sand trap. You could do that. Why am I snapping, though, to whole grid numbers? That's probably because at some point, like one of your fellow students before you, you probably hit Shift tab, which is going to turn on grid snapping. If you hit it again, it'll turn it back off. Alternatively, in the bottom of your 3D view, you got this little magnet icon that you can click on and off. If you see the red of the magnet, it is on. If it is grayed out, it is off. And that should solve your problem. So everybody should have a ball sitting on the edge of their grid. I'm going to do another ready check, and I've put all the hands down. If you have a ball sitting on the edge of your heel, give me a ready. Or raise your hand, or flap your arms up and down like a chicken. I won't be able to see that, but thinking that you're doing it is going to make me pretty happy. All right. How do you see what unit number you have moved something to? I don't think something would appreciate that. Sorry. If you take a look in your toolbox, which is this panel over on the left-hand side of your 3D view, right after you move something, you'll see that number appear. So for instance, if you watch my view real quick, I'm going to take my ball. Now, please, folks, you don't have to do what I'm about to do. I just want to mention this as a way to help out. If I drag this guy at all, make any kind of motion, take a look over here in my toolbox, you can see that I moved that in Y. Here's the vector. I moved it negative 0.03481, and I can change that value to anything I like. So it's a way to kind of update that after the fact. Now, if you have deselected or done anything else, you lose that information. So please keep that in mind. Now, while you are moving something, it's important to point this out too, because this does go overlooked. Take a look at the bottom of my 3D view right now. You see that I've got a delta value. That's what the D stands for, by the way, and that's telling me how far I am moving that. And it's doing it in coordinates and an absolute value or distance. You can look at it that way. So if I move it negative 0.6 units, it says I've moved it 0.6 units away from its original position in global space. So you are getting some information there at the bottom. Okay, so people are taking a look. We've still got mostly readies. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at creating our, well, actually before we create anything, there's something I want to do. So everybody should have your ball moved over to the side. I'm going to tap the period key on my numpad to fly me over to the ball. So now I can orbit around it like I'm a moon and it's a planet. Now here's something that I like to do. When I'm doing something like a bouncing ball, and I've done a lot of bouncing balls in my time, I like to make sure that the pivot of my bouncing ball is not at the center of the ball necessarily. I actually kind of like it to be down toward the bottom. So we're going to take a look at how we can do that. There's a few ways to go about this, and most of them involve the 3D cursor on some level. What I'm going to show you is a foolproof way to hopefully make this really easy on you. To make it even easier, though, and get other objects out of the way, I want you to select your ball, and over on your numpad, hit the slash key. If you don't have a numpad and you can't do that, you can live without doing this, but hopefully you do have a numpad, and it will make things a little bit easier. And once again, guys, we do apologize for any funny little laggy glitches that BuzzNet may be experiencing. We're going to look into that, just because I saw somebody mention it over in the chat. So all I see right now is my ball. I'm going to hit the tab key to go into edit mode. Now, by default, I have vertices selected, and I want to grab this vertex right here at the very bottom of my sphere. It's easy to assume that's going to be the lowest point of my sphere. And then with that selected, I'll hit Shift-S. This allows me to move the cursor around to different things. I'm going to move the cursor to selected, and that put the 3D cursor right there at the base of my sphere. How convenient. Hit Tab to go back over into object mode. Hit Shift-S one more time. I'm sorry, not Shift-S. It's Control, Alt, Shift-C? That's right, Control, Alt, Shift, and C. Big combination. And this allows us to move our origin. Your origin is the pivot point of your object. So with the sphere selected, you're going to hit Control, Alt, Shift, C, and take origin and set it to 3D cursor. So it's a two-part movement. Move the 3D cursor to the bottom of the sphere. Move the origin to the 3D cursor. So I want everybody to make sure that they have that, and I am looking for any other questions. Do 3D cursor again, please. Actually, I'll do you one better. What I'm going to do is put my 3D cursor way out here in space, just assuming that you might have done some random click and moved it out there. And I'm going to take my sphere and hit Control-Alt-Shift-C again, and I'm going to set the origin back to the geometry. So it should be right back where it was. So I'm going to do the whole thing over again, okay? I'm going to hit Tab and make sure I'm selecting vertices. I'm going to grab that vertex right at the very bottom of my sphere. With that selected, I'll hit Shift-S and take the cursor and send it to selected. So it moves the 3D cursor right there to that point. That's step 1. Hit Tab to get out of edit mode. Step 2 is to hit Control-Alt-Shift-C, which is kind of like hitting a chord on a real musical keyboard. And you want to take the origin and set that to the 3D cursor. That's step 2. So step 1 is move the 3D cursor to the bottom of the sphere. Step 2 is move the origin to the 3D cursor. How do you move the cursor again? One last time. So please pay attention this time. I'll click over here. Just move the 3D cursor. I'm just placing him out in space. I'm right-clicking. If you haven't changed your hotkeys, you could be left-clicking. Okay, once more. Back over in edit mode. Select a vertex. In this case, the bottommost vertex. Shift-S. Think of it like snapping, because this is the snap menu. Cursor to selected. Out of edit mode, so hit the Tab key. Control-Alt-Shift-C. Origin to 3D cursor. You're done. Origin not coming up. It's possible that you have changed your hotkeys, but here's the cool thing. You already know the name of the command. You know that it's origin to 3D cursor, so tap your spacebar and just start typing origin, and it should pop up. You see set origin. It's actually a complex command. So you click, and you'll get the little submenu for that. So again, when you're confused, as long as you know generally what your command is, always, always, always fall back on your spacebar. Spacebar will save you from so many headaches. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. I'm not going to be doing as many ready checks, just in case people were curious. So I'm just going to, actually, you know what? We can do ready checks through the webinar system. That seems to be pretty solid. So everybody who has got a ball in your scene, you've got the origin at the base of the ball, please raise your hand. Beautiful. Look at the hands just light up. And really what I'm doing is I'm looking for gaps. I'm looking for people who don't have that. All right, that's most everybody. If you are stuck on something, I need you to ask a question now so that we can move on. Zach, your frame rate is off. Yeah, that's okay. We're not animating right now, so it's not really all that critical. Now would be a good time to save to avoid any crashes, just a thought. It really is. So it's a pretty good point. So I'll just go ahead and hit Control-S. And I've already got my golf scene one. I'm just going to save over the one that I had, and there we go. So I just double-clicked that, and we're good to go. Origin to geometry is not working here. Well, you shouldn't be moving it to the geometry. You should be moving it to the 3D cursor, which should be at the bottom of your sphere, and Blender A is right. You need to be in object mode before you move the origin. The origin is something that affects the object in object mode, and so it's in object mode that you're going to have to make the motion. What version of Blender am I running? I am running 2.62. All right, so it looks like pretty much everybody is set to go. We are almost finished, folks. There's only just a couple more things that I want to do, and then we will take a quick break. So I'm going to get out of my local view by hitting my slash key again. And now what we need to do is build a very, very simple golf club. Now there's a couple of different ways we can do this. First thing I'm going to do, just for sake of simplicity, is I'm going to hit Shift-S and set my cursor back to center to put that right back in the middle of the world. Once we've done that, we're going to bring in a cube. So we're going to build our golf club out of a cube. So Shift-A, not Shift-S. So Shift-A, and bring in a cube. Now, that plops that, of course, right down in the center of the view. We can't see it because right now it's under the hill. All I'm going to do is tap the / key on my numpad to go right to a local view. So I'm looking right at it. So Mary said, maybe tell folks where the keyboard shortcut PDF is. There are a few different keyboard references that are over on blender.org. Honestly, I end up Google searching for 2.5 shortcuts. Just please make sure that you're not looking up keyboard shortcuts for any version prior to 2.5. Anything before 2.5 has the old interface, and all of the hotkeys are different. So I don't really have a singular location. I just have ones that I have looked up and read over a few times. Okay, once you have a cube in the center of your scene, we need to basically make this into a really, really simple golf club. So I'm going to hit the S key for scale and shrink this way down, so it's a very tiny little cube. Then I'm going to hit S once more, and then middle mouse drag until I am dragging along the Z-axis and just stretch this up to make it kind of long. So scale it down tiny, and then scale it to make it tall. So it's kind of like a stick. Once you have done that, we need to put it pretty much in the same location as our sphere. If you can't remember where your sphere is, get out of local mode. And what I'm going to do is drag this so it's really close by. Now, the dimensions for this are going to be a little bit important, not super crazy critical important. But if everybody kind of wants to be on the same page, I'm going to make my golf club about 2.5 units long. Now, an interesting thing you may not know, but if you take a look at a selected object and tap your N key, N as in November, inside of your 3D view, you get your transform information, which gives you the location, the rotation, and the scale, but it also gives you the dimensions, which is pretty fancy. So we could say that in Z, I want this to be about 2.5 units, and press Enter, and it shrinks it right back down. What was the shortcut for scale again? You're never going to guess. It's S.
No way.
Yeah, seriously, I know. Crazy. Unless you've switched over to like the Maya hotkeys for some reason, in which case...
R.
Actually, in which case you should already know it.
Yeah, really. Because R matches right up with scale.
That's right. Because you want it to be really big. And I'm trying to come up with something for E for rotate. But,
Yeah.
But let's not get too distracted because these are not the hotkeys for Blender. They're just the hotkeys for Blender if you have it in Maya mode. Okay, so we should have a stick in the view that is about 2.5 units tall. Does everybody have a stick? I've just put all your hands down. Oh my god, oh, this is great. Miguel just says, and he said it in all caps too, which I'd please appreciate it if you'd avoid in the future, says, my widget is stuck at the origin when I move the cube. I'm sure it is. And here's what you did. If you take a look in your 3D view, you have the ability to change the space in which you're moving everything. So right here, if I click our pivot point, you've currently set that to your 3D cursor. So just take a look at the location of that here inside your 3D view. Watch what happens when I set this to 3D cursor. I can move that cube around all day long, but that widget stays right there at the location of the 3D cursor. And so you think, well, that's fine. I'll just right-click on my object to move it over there, and then you move it, and it stays behind, and it's really frustrating. So make sure that you take that and set it from 3D cursor back over to either median point or active element. Now, I'm going to hit Control-Z a few times and put everything back where it was. Is there a safe frame for the 3D view for lining up the camera? Right now, it's irrelevant. We haven't lined up the camera. Switching to video, unable to keep up. No problem. That's very cool, and I'll just look forward to seeing you in the video. So actually, you're probably watching this now, streaming in the future. So hi.
My head.
Yeah, because I can handle time travel in that manner. Do you mind showing us the dimensions of your plane hill? Yeah, sure. Why not? So it's 16 by 16, and it's about 3.5 units tall. All right. So let's see. And somebody just mentioned, and this is very nice, Lars Daniel Forseth said, FYI, BlenderGuru.com has a nice PDF with shortcuts.
Nice.
So there you go. That might be where I got like some of the PDFs that I've been using. Honestly, I just Google searched hotkeys and went from there. And for those of you who are leaving, goodbye, and hope to see you later. It looks like I've got pretty good chunk of hands. Let me check again. I'm going to put everybody's hands down. Do you all have a nice stick next to your ball?
Just a thought another way could be resetting all of those hands and then say raise your hand only if you're still working on it.
Yeah, okay, that's a good idea. Raise your hand if you still need a minute.
There you go. Yeah, so now we know those people are still working.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And if you're stuck, let me know. It seems like my sphere and stick are linked. Hey, then here's probably what you did. And this is to David. Let me go ahead and select my sphere. And I'm going to fly over to it with the period key on my numpad. If you were in if you're in edit mode and you went to add and you added anything, it could be our cube, while you were in edit mode, now these two objects are the same thing. Basically, you've added a part to your object. Now, there is a way to fix that. You can use the separate command. So you could just tap the spacebar and just type separate. Isn't it separate? It's not actually showing me separate. Maybe it's not separate. What is that command anyway? Wait. I could have sworn it was, unless they just changed it. But you can also just hit the P key and, Shift. I just went into game mode. I might have just crashed Blender.
No.
Yeah, because if you just hit the P key by itself, that opens up the Blender game engine. And I don't think I've been able to use this since this version of Blender came out without it crashing. And yes, you do need to be in edit mode to use separate, which I just did keep in mind while I was hitting the command. And yeah, Blender is dead. So be careful of the P key, and this is on my system as well. Whenever I hit P and go into game mode, I do get a lot of crashes. So the Blender game engine right now just seems to have a few issues. Now let's see, if I try recover last session, that gets me right back where I left off. Let's go over to edit mode and space, and then type separate, and there's separate. Boom. And that'll divide those back out. So you can separate selection, and now that is two entirely separate objects. But I would advise that you don't add objects while you're in edit mode, and then it won't be an issue. All right, so let me go ahead and nuke this guy back out, and I'm going to reset. Okay, who doesn't have a stick? All right, that's just like one or two stragglers, so I think we're pretty good to go from here. Now, what I want to do at this point is take our stick. I'm going to zoom up on it. And this time we are going to do exactly what I talked about a second ago. We are going to add an object in edit mode, but first, hit Shift-S to take your 3D cursor and move it to your object. So you can just say cursor to selected, that'll be fine, just to get it somewhere over here in the vicinity of your stick. It doesn't have to be in an exact location. Then, while we are in edit mode, so make sure you hit Tab, verify that you are in edit mode, we're going to hit Shift-A to add, and we're going to add in a cube. Now it comes in selected, which is pretty handy. So what I'm going to do is just scale this down. So tap the S key to scale, shrink that down to something about the size of a club, and you'll probably need to elongate it a little bit. So I'm going to hit S again, this time middle mouse drag to scale only on Y. So somewhere right about there. Again, not an exact science.
It's Thor's hammer.
It is. We're playing Minecraft now. But if you want to see the dimensions that I had, well, actually, it's not going to do you much good at this point because these are all kind of the same thing. But the X and Y on it would be useful. So it's 0.32 by 0.525. But we're going to take this, move it up to the very top, slide it forward a little bit, and then kick it out to the side just a little. So it's a little more golf club-like. And then finally, for the pièce de résistance, we are going to rotate this. And I'm using middle mouse so that I'm rotating only on X. So as soon as you have the X-axis selected, you release middle mouse, and there you go. Now, how you go about it is fine. There's all kinds of ways. If you don't like using these shortcut keys, please make use of your transformation widgets. They can save you a lot of time, especially if you're new to this. So for instance, if you're still really confused about how to manipulate objects with hotkeys, you could just use the move widget to move this guy up to the top and then slide it forward. And then to kick it out to the side. And then you can just switch over to rotate to rotate it back on X a little bit. And then if you needed to move it further for some finessing, you can just do that there. So please make use of your widgets if you need to. If you don't see your widgets, please make sure you hit Control Spacebar to show them again.
And Annie had a question for you over in the questions panel.
Let's see, Annie says, what was it to make the cube attach to the stick? Well, actually, because we were in edit mode when we added the cube, they are one and the same object. If you have done something else, for instance, like, well, let me do it this way. While I'm in edit mode, and this, you don't have to follow along with this, I'm just doing this as a demonstration, please. If I separate this selection, so if maybe this is what you had, where you had two separate objects, you can hold down Shift and make sure you select both of these, tap the spacebar and type join, which is also just Control-J, and you can join them together and make them the same thing. It's the exact same thing either way you go. It's just joining will do it after the fact, or if you add it while you're in edit mode, then they'll both be the same thing. So, once more, I just want to know, I joined them, but they are 5 feet apart. Probably, I'm guessing, is because you did not create your cube after moving the 3D cursor to your selection. So here's what I'm going to do real quick for you. Let me go ahead and just delete out this face. I'm just going to go through it again real fast. So I'm going to delete out faces, and that'll get rid of that extra part. And again, this is just demo. You don't have to follow along. This is just for folks who are stuck. I'm going to move the cursor back to center. So if your 3D cursor was floating out here in space when you added in your cube, then there's going to be some space in between them, and that can be an issue. So let me undo that. I'll hit Control-Z. What I like to do first is, while I'm still in object mode, so I just hit Tab to go back to object mode, I'll hit Shift-S and move the cursor to the selected object. So that puts my 3D cursor right here in the middle of my stick to begin with, which is pretty convenient. Then I'll make sure I'm in edit mode, so hit Tab, Shift-A to go to the Add menu, add in a cube, and now we just go from here. We get this position scaled, etc., and so forth. So I'll do this with the widgets this time around because we're here. I'll grab my scale widget, and if you click within this white circle, you can scale down uniformly. And then I'll scale it out a little bit in Y, maybe thin it out a little bit in X, you know, just have some fun. Switch over to the Move widget, and I'll drag this back up to the top. Let me go ahead and rotate it back in X, like so. Maybe about there. And get my Move widget one more time. We'll slide this forward and kick it out a little bit out to the side. There you go. Now let's see, do we have any other questions coming in? Let's see, that takes care of that. Folks talking in chat. I do not always get a chance to recognize questions asked in chat, so if you have something you really want me to address, please make sure that you put the question over in the webinar question system for the time being, or in the BuzzNet question system, though some folks have been experiencing a few issues with that, so for now, please fall back on the webinar question system. Okay. So I'm going to reset everybody's hands. Who still needs a minute to get this done? Seeing just a few people, so it looks like most folks have this. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and start a break now. We've got our basic geometry that we need for our animatics already created and ready to go. So I'm going to pause everything and take a break. If you need to use the first part of this break to catch up, please do that. For everybody else, it's a good time to run out and go grab something to drink or whatever you need. We're going to resume in between 5 to 10 minutes, okay? So I'm starting a break. Okay, we are back. Now, during the break, somebody pitched in a couple of questions. Somebody said, how do I get the far right properties pane back? Thanks. Well, the far right properties pane, being the actual properties editor on the right-hand side of my interface, really only goes away, one, if you tell it to by like squashing it down to nothing or collapsing into another editor, or if you've hit Control-Up arrow to go into full screen or kind of like expert mode in Macs. If that's the case, just hit Control-Up arrow again to get back out of that. Okay. So, at this point, so how do you get the dimensions after the fact? After the fact of what? That's kind of a complicated question. If you select any object, the dimensions, which is basically the size of the bounding box of that object, will always be visible over in the properties pane. It's not the properties panel on the far right side. It's only inside the 3D editor. Tap the N key as in November, and up near the top of that window, you'll see dimensions. So that handles that. Okay, so we need to do some animation. but we have not quite a problem. Just something that we need to address. We need to give our ball the ability to swing a golf club, and we need him to be able to do it very, very easily. I don't know about you. I don't know how many of you out there have ever tried to animate objects, but trying to take something like a stick that is swinging in a perfect arc and animate that out by hand can be a real pain. So what we're going to do is build a very, very simple character rig that is just going to aid us in the animation of the golf swing specifically. Now, somebody said my golf club is upside down. The quickest way I can think of to fix that would be to go into edit mode and just rotate it or flip it around however it needs to be. Any quick way to connect the two objects together, the cube and the stick? Absolutely. If they are two separate objects over inside of object mode, so make sure you're in object mode, select them both. So select one. Hold down the Shift key and select the other. And then you want to do a join command. That's going to be with Control-J or tap the spacebar and type join. And that should bring the two together as a single object, and everybody should be happy. All right. So now, moving back into everything. Again, we need the ability to swing our club very easily. Now, let's see here. I have actually made a left-handed club, and I really want my guy to be... Well, he's going to be swinging this like he's right-handed, so I'm going to change my club side to this side. Not that it matters that much, but that's just me being a little nitpicky. If you know how golf clubs work, then you know what I just did. If you don't know how golf clubs work, then, again, it doesn't matter particularly much. Even if it was centered, this is all really more about timing than anything else. Let's see, Wolf Knight said, I would like to just move the cube at the top and not the stick. How can I do that? Well, I'm going to go way out on a limb here. If you're in edit mode, you should already be able to do this. If you can't do that for some reason, if the stick is still following you along even though it's not selected, one, you want to make sure the stick is not selected. If it's still coming along, it's possible that you have proportional editing on. If that's the case, cut your eyes down here to the bottom of your 3D view and make sure that proportional editing is either set to disable or tap the O key to switch that off. And how do you unjoin? Well, you need to go into edit mode, like I am now, and you want to run a separate command, which I believe is going to be, what is it, Control-P? Actually, maybe it's Shift-P. Really, I'm so used to just using the spacebar for this, so if you just type spacebar and do separate, like so. So let's see, if I hit Shift-P, no, that's not going to do it, and Control-P is not going to do it either. Wait, okay, make vertex parent, So just use the separate command. I can't select just the cube. How are you doing that? Oh, really quick, watch this. Well, you can, it's really just a matter of 8 whole vertices. So I know you could do that, or it's really just 6 faces. You could grab those too. Another way, though, you could grab one of these vertices, and I didn't show this trick, but here you go anyway. If you hit Control-L, you can grab all linked vertices, and that means that those are all vertices that are connected by geometry. The stick and the club are 2 separate pieces, if you will, so they're not really connected in that way. They're not linked. So select a vertex, hit Control-L, and that will grab just the cube, or just click on the vertices. It's probably not as hard of a task as you think. So let's hit Tab to go back to object mode, and now I want to get back on task a little bit, where I'm going to create this very, very simple character rig for our ball. So here's what we'll do. Select your ball. And before we get too much further, I'm going to do a quick aside. We need to name a few things in our scene. We haven't been doing that, and it's not a very good habit, even though this is an animatic scene and not something we're going to keep forever. I'm going to grab my plane, which is currently called plane, and we're just going to call this the ground, or you can call it the hill. It doesn't matter. Call it whatever you want to. And then I'll grab the ball, and I'm going to call this, actually, character. And we'll grab the golf club, and we'll call this, you guessed it, golf club. So at least we have some names going on here. I'm not going to worry about the camera and the light right now. Not important. Okay, so now we're going to select our ball. And I need to move the 3D cursor to the center of this object, right at the dead center. So let's hit Shift-S. And we're going to say cursor to selected. And it's going to move that here. Now, at the moment, you'll notice we have a little bit of a dilemma. The 3D cursor is jumping over here to the bottom of our object. If we wanted to move it to the center, we could kind of reverse some of the steps that we've done before. We could reset our origin with Control-Alt-Shift-C and set the origin back to the geometry, and then move the 3D cursor back over to the origin. If you don't follow that, don't worry, I'm not actually going to do that. We're going to do kind of an inexact science thing. All I really want is the 3D cursor over here somewhere near the ball. So if you just take your 3D cursor, hit Shift-S, and send it over to selected so it's back at the base of the ball, that's more than good enough for what we're going to do. Once it's there, hit Shift-A, and you're going to bring in an empty. For you Maya people, this is a locator. For you Max people, this is a helper object. For everybody else in the world, it's a null. It doesn't really do anything. It really just designates a point in space. Now, once you have your empty in the scene, what I want you to do is drag that up to about the center of the ball. It does not need to be exact. And if you have a hard time seeing through your ball, tap the Z key to go into wireframe view. Now, I hit the 3 key on my numpad to go into that right orthographic view if you need to do the same thing. But please, please, please keep in mind, as this class rolls forward, I will quit worrying about navigating the viewport in terms of commands. I really need you guys to practice that and get very comfortable with jumping between different views. All right, it says when I hit right ortho, it goes to right perspective. Any way to change that, or toggle rather? Yeah, that's going to be with tapping the 5 key in the middle of the numpad. All right, so once you have your empty right in the middle of your sphere, the next thing you're going to need to do is increase the size of this. Now, if you take a look over in your properties panel on the far right-hand side, the next thing you've got over there, you see the object data, and it looks like a little tiny version of an empty. If you click on this, the display is set to plain axes, which is fine, but if you increase the size just a little bit, you can get those lines to extend out the sides of your sphere. That'll just make selecting this easier here in just a moment. Once you've done that, rename this object. So you can go over to its object panel, or alternatively, you can, if you have your in panel open, your properties panel open here in the 3D view, if you scroll, it's not quite halfway down, you'll see the item area, and you can rename things there too. So we're going to call this the swing null. I call these things nulls. That's just what I'm used to calling them. Does it matter if we scale the empty instead of changing its size? Not at all. I like to, as long as you scaled it uniformly. If you scaled it non-uniformly, you could run into a few glitches. Potentially. All right, so once you have that, I'm going to rotate back out of here. I'm going to hit Z to go back into my solid view. Now, we need to do a little bit of parenting. I want this null to go wherever the ball goes. So I'm going to select the empty, hold down Shift, and select the character ball. And, oh Lord, I tried to hit Control-P and my Control key didn't read. So let's see. Oh, Escape got me back out. That's good. So let's hit Control-P and choose Object. So again, that's Control-P and choose Object. Please, though, be very aware of the order that I selected those. You want to select the empty first. Then you want to select the ball and hit Control-P. That is going to parent the empty to the object. You'll know you did it right because you can select the object, or you can select the ball and move it around, and the empty will just come along. If the empty stays behind, you did it in the wrong order. You'll also know you did it right because over in your outliner, you'll see the character, and if you expand character, you should see the empty underneath it. All right, by the way, you know that double-click the name in the scene view works to rename. I've done that a couple of times, but it's not something I'm really used to doing, like so many things. So if you double click, was it down here? No, it's in the scene view. Oh, you mean like in the outliner? Yeah, absolutely. So whatever works. Okay, I think that should be everything there. Okay, so now the next thing, we're going to do some more parenting. I want you to grab your golf club, hold down Shift, and grab that empty, which is in the middle of your ball, and hit Control-P once again. That is going to parent the golf club to that empty. Now you might be wondering, why am I doing this? Well, the reason is so that later on we can just grab this empty, and if I switch over to the rotate manipulator, I can just rotate it, and the golf club moves around in a nice little arc. That'll be very handy here in just a little bit as we rough out the animation for the golf swing.
Not only that, but because of all of the parenting, if you grab your ball and move it now.
Oh, it's true. We'll also be able to bring the club right along for the ride. Okay, I'm going to do a very simple ready check. Is there anybody who's still working on this? Are we ready to start animating? Because from here on out, we're going to start actually creating our animation. Okay, just a couple of people. For the most part, I see people ready to rock. Who parents who, the null or the club? Okay, take a look at the hierarchy over here inside the outliner. The character is the parent of the swing null. The swing null is the parent of the golf club. It goes in that order. So if you're to do it all over again, you could do it in this order. Take the golf club, and then select the null, and hit Control-P. Then select the null, then the ball, and hit Control-P. When I parent to the golf club, I lose the character parent. You shouldn't be parenting anything to the golf club. The golf club is actually the lowest level of the hierarchy. So you should be selecting the golf club, which should be the child of the null. The null should be the child of the character, as you can see in the outliner right now. And yes, you can drag objects in the outliner if you are having a rough time actually making this happen any other way. In fact, let me see here. Let me do an Alt+P to clear parents for just a moment. Please don't follow along if you don't have to. I'm deparenting everything, doing some unparenting. So over here inside my outliner, just to illustrate what Mohammed was pointing out, we can take the golf club and drag it over to the swing null. So if I take this little icon and I click and drag, like so, that just dragged it and parented it to the swing null. And then I can take the swing null and drag that over to the character, and that parents that like so. Which is totally in the wrong order, by the way. So I need to do swing null to the character, and then golf club to the swing null. Then everybody's happy. Okay, so it looks like for the most part people are ready to move on past this, so now it's time for us to start animating. Now, I'm going to give you guys just a heads up. This will be a pretty rough animation. We are not going to be tweaking this out to absolute perfection. Our big task here is to get a really general idea of our timing. These animatics are kind of a go-between. They are something in between the storyboards and our final 3D scene. They're kind of like a hybrid. They're not going to give us a really solid idea of exactly what our shot is going to look like, but they will give us an idea of how and when things are going to be moving, and that's what we're going to really aim for here. Now, I want you guys to start animating the right way early on. I want to see some good habits straight out of the gate. So instead of just dropping down keyframes with our objects early on, we're going to create what is called a keying set. For you Maya people out there in the audience, these are character sets. And if you're familiar with using them, they will save you a lot of time, and most importantly, they will save you a lot of excess keyframes as you work. So, to create a keying set, if we jump out to and let me close down my outliner, it's just a little too big. If you jump over to your properties panel and go under the scene icon, which looks like a little sphere and a cylinder and a light, like so, you'll notice about 3/4 of the way down the list is the keying sets group. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create one of these keying sets, and I really just want you guys to follow along right now. Later on, once we get into our animation lessons, I'll talk a lot more about keying sets, about keyframes, and how all of this works. For now, it's more important that you follow along and get this down. I'm just going to click the plus key next to keying sets and create a brand new keying set. Now, there's an area where we can rename this keying set, and it's very hard to see with the size of the window, so I'm going to stretch this out just a little bit. And I'm going to call this the ball set, or ball key set. Now, in short, what a keying set is just a collection of properties that will be animated. This allows us to say, I want to animate these properties and not those properties. So thereby focusing down what it is we're going to be animating. You can unparent. Wolf Knightley just asked, how do you unparent? You can do that with Alt+P. So select a child that's parented to somebody and hit Alt+P. Okay, so you've got your keying set in place. Now select your ball. Your ball for now is what you're going to be animating. Now let's go over to its object panel. Now this is over inside the properties panel. Please note where my mouse is. Over on the right hand side, I'm going to click on object. And we can see all of this guy's transforms. I'm also going to hide my properties panel over here for a little less visual confusion on the screen. Now, all we are animating in terms of the ball at the moment is just its location. If you really wanted to be specific, we're really only going to be animating the Z and the Y translate. But just in case, we'll go ahead and leave X in there too, though I don't anticipate X getting any actual motion. What I'm going to do is right-click on my location. You'll notice you have transforms. It has location, it has rotation, and it has scale. On the far left-hand side, you'll see location. Right-click on that, and you'll see Add All to Keying Set. If you hit P and you think you crashed, hit Escape. Because sometimes you can get back out with Escape. Other times, not so much. At least on my systems. So we'll hit Add All to Keying Set. Now, it looks like nothing actually happened there, so what you can do is jump over to Scene. And now if you take a look in your keying set, the active keying set is currently set to location, and you can see under the ID block, this is a little bit to read, and I'm not trying to inundate you with information, but it is telling you that everything's okay. Inside of this keying set, we have the object character, and we're actually paying specific attention to its location information right now. Now, why is that important? It's because here in just a minute, we're going to turn on the auto key feature. And once we turn that on, we can also turn on automatic keyframe insertion using active keying set only. That means while we work, we're only going to be keying the location of the ball and nothing else. No other parts of the ball. We're not going to be accidentally keying its rotation. We're not going to be accidentally keying its scale or anything else like that. It's just a way to really narrow down exactly what it is that we're animating. Okay, so moving on from here. Let's go ahead and turn on auto key. Immediately go ahead and turn on automatic keying for your keying set. The two buttons are right next to each other. They need to be dark gray, meaning they're depressed and active. And with that, we can actually begin the animation process. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever tried to animate anything before. I'm curious. Who amongst you has ever animated in... Oh, sorry. Oh, let me reverse this. Who has never animated in 3D? Raise your hand if you've never animated in 3D, ever in your whole life. That's a pretty good chunk of people. More than I anticipated, to be sure. No problem. We're going to take this one layer of animation at a time. I do want to stress, though, the way in which I'm going to do this is... It's kind of been sculpted to make it easier for you to follow along. In most cases, in a best case scenario, you already know kind of what your animation is going to be. And you can do this too. You can animate walk cycles in a similar fashion to what I'm doing, where maybe you just get the placement of the feet on each step. And then you go through a second time, and then you actually get the feet to lift as they step. And that's how we're going to handle this. We're going to do this through layering our animation. So our first pass of animation, if you will, is just going to be to get the ball to go from where it starts to where it ends. That's all we're going to do. Now, for timing purposes, if we go back to our storyboards, and let me see, do I still have my storyboards active?
Look over on the left side.
If I jump over here, I don't, but I can bring them up real quick. And pardon me for just a second. Let's go to... I'm just bringing up my storyboards so that everybody can see the first one. If you have them active, that's great. Let me pull this up for everybody and jump over to frame 1, because I just want to point one quick thing out. All right, so we have about 1 second where nothing's going to be happening. So we don't want to animate straight from frame 0. So just to keep everybody kind of on target with what I'm doing right now. So I can go ahead and close that out.
And do we want to make sure that we're still at the 30 frames?
That's my next thing. Before I start dropping any keyframes, we're going to make sure that we're still at 30 frames a second. Now, really, that's just going to affect playback speed, so it's still not that big of a deal. As long as we, in our heads, we're animating with 30 frames a second in mind, we'll still be okay. So what I'm going to do is jump over to frame 30. That's about a second in. And we're going to create our very first keyframe. To do that, you'll notice here at the bottom of my timeline, I've got currently the ball keying set is active. If you see anything else in here, if you see available, if you see location, if you see anything, make sure this is set to ball key set, to what we had active before. Now, for those of you out there who have been using Blender, if you're suddenly inclined to ask, isn't that the same as location? The answer right now is yes, but let's just go with that for now. I'm going to click on my key button here at frame 30. And now it says at the top, successfully added 3 keyframes. So it actually keyframed location X, location Y, and location Z. All right, next we're going to assume that we do 3 bounces, each at about a second a pop. How did you move to frame 30? I did that with the right mouse button here in your timeline. Now, in my case, it's the right mouse button. Please understand, I have swapped my left and right select key. So if you find that you need to click with left mouse, it's because you're still using the standard select with right mouse feature that Blender does. You can also use Alt and the scroll wheel. You can also use your arrow keys to jump around the timeline. You can also take this little tiny info panel here in your timeline and set this directly to 30 or 60 or any number that you like. You can also click and drag that. There's all kinds of ways to get around your timeline. So, of course, once you have that, click your little key button. And this is the key button that is right next to your current keying set. It says Insert Keyframes for all objects on the current frame, etc. Now, I'm going to move forward 90 frames. That's 3 seconds. 1 second for each bounce. So 30 plus 90 is 120. We can drag that over, or we can just come over here and punch in manually 120. Takes us right there. Now, we could key again, but since we've turned on automatic keying, what I'm going to do is move my ball to the top of the hill. Now, again, please note I'm in an orthographic right view, and what I'm going to do actually is put my ball slightly behind the pinnacle of the hill. Not an exact science, once again, but this just means that when he gets his club out, he's going to be swinging like right over the top of the hill. Now, once you've done that, you can now drag with your right mouse button, and you have some basic animation. Now, here's where things are going to start to get fun. Why would it say failure to insert keyframe? I'm going to guess that maybe you haven't added anything into your keying set. That could be one thing. So you do need to make sure that while you have the object selected, you can go over into the object panel, right-click on location, and make sure that you have clicked Add All to Keying Set. And then you're going to want to make sure that the ball key set that we created earlier is going to be your active key set. So that's going to be important. Now, this is where things are going to start to get fun and a little bit interesting, because we are going to have to start playing with animation curves now. Now, I'm going to assume that all of you who raised your hands a moment ago to say that you've never animated in 3D are not much for working with animation curves. If that's the case, don't be alarmed. I'm going to take this nice and slow, and right now it's more important that you just follow along and get to see this stuff and touch it and play with it a little bit. If you don't fully understand what's going on, that's okay. This class is going to have an animation section where we do our final animation, and in that section, I'll be talking a lot more about exactly all the nuances of playing with animation curves, adjusting keyframes, working with the curve editor in detail, and things like that. So for now, we'll keep this very, very simple. However, I do need to make some changes to my interface. So here in my 3D view, I'm going to mouse over these diagonal lines in the lower left-hand corner and drag those up to split my view. Once I've done that, I'm going to take the bottom pane and click on our editor type button. It's located in the lower left-hand corner, and we're going to change this over to a graph editor. Wolfline, is it too late to figure out what and how to do the animations? Should I stop participation? At this stage, that's going to be kind of up to you. What I have done at this point, just as a very, very quick recap, is over in the scene area, I have added a brand new keying set, so click plus. I named that ball key set. I then selected my object, went over to the object panel, right-clicked its location, and I added all of those properties, so add all to keying set. What that does is basically I've created a group of properties that I'd like to be able to animate, and then I added the location into that group. That's how that works. Next, I turned on auto key and key for keying set. These are located down here in the timeline. A little red button and a couple of pairs of keys. Turn both of those on. Then between frames 30 and 120, all I did was I created a one keyframe at frame 30 just by clicking on this little tiny key button here, located next to your keying set, which you should see. You should already see the ball key set located there. Right next to it is your add key button. So we clicked on that once, then moved up to frame 120, which you can do with the right mouse button, and then just move the ball to the top of the hill. And because auto key is on, that handles the rest of it. So that's just a really quick recap. I realized that if you're kind of fighting to catch up, then there's going to be a struggle for just a minute. Okay, so now we're going to clean up a little bit of our motion at this point. And this is something that if you are totally new to the world of animation curves, this will be very intimidating at first, but I don't want you to panic. This is all very, very easy stuff once you get the hang of it. If we take a look over inside our graph editor, you'll see we have the character selected. Underneath that, we'll see character action. And then we have our ball key set. There's our group of animated keyframes. If you expand this, you'll see the 3 channels that we have animated. One of these does not belong necessarily. Can you imagine which one of these we didn't really animate? It would be the x-axis. So I'll go ahead and I'll just turn that off. So we're going to leave x just sitting there at 0. And we're not even going to look at it. Right now, all we've really animated is Y and Z. We already have those keyframes selected, but if for some reason they're not selected, you can just click and hold down Shift and select all 4 of these. You want to make sure you have all 4 of these keyframes selected. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to change the type of curve that we are using. Right now, this is a Bezier curve, and we don't want that for our lateral motion. So I'm going to hit the T key, and this allows us to change our keyframe interpolation. Again, that's the T key. And we're just going to set this over to linear. If you don't want to use hotkeys for some reason, you can go over to Key, under the menu here for the graph editor, and you'll see interpolation mode, and you can change it there as well. But you want to make sure this is set not to constant, like I just did, but make sure that's set over to linear. This gives you a nice constant progression of motion across the course of your animation. Because prior to this, what we had is the animation sped up and slowed down as we get to the top. The problem with that is that's going to make our bounces look a little bit weird. Now, up here in my view, I'm going to hold down Shift and middle mouse and just kind of navigate us around a little bit, maybe zoom out to give us some room to see all of our jumps. And if I hold down the right mouse button and scrub in my timeline, you'll see we have this nice general progression straight from the bottom to the top. That is our first layer of motion. Now, I'm going to put everybody's hands down. Please raise your hand if you need another second to get this done. See a couple of hands, but for the most part, things are looking good. Okay, so it looks like we can go ahead and go on. All right, now what we're going to do is, as you mentioned, or as I mentioned a second ago, each one of these jumps is going to be about 30 frames in. So moving forward from frame 30, we're going to go to frame 60. And all I want to do is place a key, which I could do by clicking buttons and whatnot, but because auto key is on, all I'm going to do is just move my ball so he's resting pretty much on the hill. If his belly is interpenetrating the hill a little bit, don't be alarmed by this. At this stage, he's probably still going to be behind the hill anyway. And even if he wasn't, the motion is going to be so fast while he's bouncing that there's really nothing to worry about. On top of that, there's going to be grass involved as well at some point too. So right now, don't worry about that. And actually, on top of everything, these are just animatics. Now you'll notice that made a change to our Z motion, but not to our Y motion, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. The reason I know it hasn't changed is because we still have a perfect straight line. Anytime you see straight lines in an animation curve, it means something did not change. All right, so now we're going to go from 60 to 90, and we're just going to move this guy and put him back on the hill once more. And really, that's it for our next stage of animation. It's easier to see what happened here inside the graph editor. And I'm going to do something that's going to freak some of you out. If you're not used to working with graph editors, this could be a little scary. If you hold down Control and drag with the middle mouse button, you can do some really scary things to your graph editor. That's because this is a graph of value over time, and if you need to expand the value, you can do that by dragging up. If you need to expand time, you can do that by dragging out. What I'm going to do is drag upward a little bit to increase value, release Control, and just drag with middle mouse. So you can pan with middle mouse. You can kind of zoom in and out in both dimensions using Control. And the reason I'm doing this is just to show you how our Z curve has now changed. So you see how we're changing speeds basically as we go to different altitudes. Okay, and if you want to be able to see all of your curves, you can tap the Home key, and that's just going to kind of stretch everything out so it fits nicely inside that window. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to our next stage. So we now have our ball bouncing. Well, actually, he's not bouncing. We've established where he's going to be landing. So we know at frame 30, he's going to be on the ground. At 60, he's going to be on the ground. At 90, he's going to be on the ground. And at 120, he's going to be on the ground. So now let's do the in-betweens. So I'm going to jump over here to frame 45. That is right in between 30 and 60. And I'm just going to pull my ball up into the air, like so. Doesn't need to be a crazy bounce, just a few little units will do. So actually, for those of you out there, because I know there's at least one of you who'd be like, well, exactly how high do you move it? I moved mine up about 1.3 units. But again, not an exact science and something that's very easy to edit later if you don't like what you see. Now, I'm just checking in with folks around here. Suzanne, how are you doing? How are you doing? Okay. All right. Well, she's going to be following along with the video a bit later. Okay, so let's go ahead and take our next bounce. So I'm going to scrub forward to frame 75, and we'll lift this up for our next bounce. Again, about 1.3 units from where it was, but it's not an exact science and not critical that you get the same value. I'm just kind of doing that for the sake of teaching. And then do the same thing. We'll just drag over here to frame 105, which is dead center, and we'll go up 1.3 again, and there you go. So we have bounces. They look like horrible bounces. So if you want to play, you can click your play button. And that looks terrible.
Best animation ever.
I know. Or you can also just hit Alt+A, and that will play back as well. Now, currently, we have a huge portion of our timeline showing, and it's a lot more than we need. We're going all the way to frame 250. What I'm going to do is change my start and my end times. We're going to change start to about 25. That'll just give me a little bit of dead space at the beginning. And my end time to about 125. So that now, when I play, I'm just watching those bounces over and over again. It's just a way to focus down the timeline, to just look at exactly what we want to see and nothing else. So I want to put everybody's hand down. Is there anybody who's still working to get to this stage where you've got a ball doing some really nasty-looking bounces going up a hill? For the most part, it looks like everybody's with us. I see 2 students who are not. That would be Matt and Sabine. There's Jesse. If you guys are having problems, please go ahead and mention. Does changing the start and end clear any keyframes, or does it just focus it down? It just focuses it down. It's just a way for us to keep track of what it is we're looking at right now. We'll, in fact, later on, we're going to end up with keyframes that trail way off the outside of those bounds, so no worries there. All right, one last time. How do you shorten the keyframes? Shorten the keyframes. A keyframe is a recording of a property value at a given time, so I'm not sure what shortening them means.
Maybe the range on the time slider?
That's got to be. Well, it could be. Oh, I mean a timeline. Oh. Well, shortening it basically means we're just changing the start and end times here in the timeline. Now, you also have some navigation in this window as well, so you can middle mouse drag to pan it around, and you could have zoomed in and out of it, which I generally do with the mouse wheel. And the other thing I was doing inside the graph editor was hold down Control and drag with middle mouse, and that allows you to zoom in and out in independent dimensions. So you can just zoom in and out of value, and you can just zoom in and out of your time. Okay, so I think it's probably a good time for us to go ahead and move on. Is it possible to lock align the timeline to the curve editor horizontally? Not that I'm aware. I'm not going to say no and never again, but not that I'm aware, and I've never done it before. Never really felt the need to, though. Okay, so with all of that done, let's go ahead and hit Alt+A to stop playback, and now let's make our bounces look a little bit better. Now, the way I'm going to handle this is a little bit unique. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do this. One will give you a better looking bounce, but it still may look a little weird. And then I'll show you a little bit of a tweaking trick. Just, I don't know, because I feel like it. First, though, why does our bounce look really funny? I mean, I know like it's hard to get somebody to just answer me immediately, but the reason our bounces look really funny as we play back is because our ball is moving in these straight lines. That doesn't look like a bounce at all. He's going up into the air and then coming back down at this really weird angle. So what I'm going to do is grab the peak points of that bounce, and that's along the Z location curve. You'll see it because it is blue. In fact, we could go ahead and hide the Y location curve altogether for now. And then if I hit the home key, that'll zoom up on that, make it a lot easier to see. So we're just going to grab those peak points, holding down Shift, for all 3 of those bounces. And then I'm going to hit T and set these over to Bezier. Actually, you know what? Let's just do it with everybody. So I'm just going to hit A. Grab all these points, and then hit T, and we'll set them all over to Bezier. Now, this helps a bit, but it's still not perfect. In fact, if we play back now, we have this wavy motion. It's a good place to start. The reason it still looks funny is because our ball is actually slowing down right before it hits the ground. So it's kind of like he's waving more than he is bouncing up and down. So now that'll be the next thing we fix. Let's go ahead and hit Alt+A to stop animation. I'm going to grab all of my troughs. So starting at the bottom, the bottom, and the bottom, holding down Shift to make this selection. And we're going to hit the V key, not T, but V. And this will allow us to change the handle type. You want to set this over to free. Now, when you do this, you can move each one of these handles individually. By moving these handles, you can change the nature of the curve. Now, I'm assuming, at least at one point in your life, you've watched something bounce. And when something bounces, it comes into the ground at full speed. There's no slowing down. Now, I'm not going to make this a big, long, drawn-out discussion of animation curves. So for now, if it's easier, if you're totally new to this, what you want to do is take all of your troughs and turn them into points. If you're an Illustrator person, these are called cusp points. Now, what this means in terms of the animation is that there's no more of that funny slowdown. So now, if we hit Alt+A again to start playing, we have a much cleaner bounce. Say that again, please. I'm not sure what that is. What are you trying to do? And I will happily repeat myself. It could be using the V key to change your key type. We change them over to free. And then you want to take all of your troughs and make them into points. Okay, good. It was that. Okay, so real quick, raise of hands. Who still needs a second to get to this point? Okay, a few people. I'll give you guys just a moment to go ahead and get that knocked out. And now you should have a much bouncier motion. It's still not perfect. It's not the best ever. So probably we need to minimize the time for the floating in the air if you catch my drift. Mohammed, let me teach this at my rate, okay? Because I got a plan, all right? When a guy's got a plan, don't get in the way of his plan. I'm going to show you guys a really cool trick to tweak that out. You're fine. I'm just giving you a little bit of... I'm ribbing you. That's my elbow in your ribs right now. That's what's going on. Can you repeat how to make it into points? I can do that. If you select the troughs of each one of those keys. So let me come back over here. So you're going to select all of these guys. Like so. And that's holding down Shift to make that multi-selection, by the way. Tap the V key. V is in Victor. Or violin. Or many other words that start with V. And you're going to choose free. Once you've done that, you could move each one of these handles individually. And basically, you want to turn them all into little letter Vs. Using consummate Vs. And 5 points for anybody who caught that. All right, now, once you have that, I want one more time. Who needs another moment to get that done? Because I really kind of want to move on. All right, the number of people is starting to narrow. All right, I got the same couple of folks who seem to be kind of having a hard time, but I haven't heard anything from them. So I need to hear back from you guys. Matt and Sabine, tell me where you are. Tell me what's up. Tell me where you need assistance so we can get you guys caught up. You can use the question system over inside the webinar system. You're just tweaking. Oh, if you're just tweaking, then I'm not too stressed. Matt, how about you? Where are you at? I'm just wanting Matt to answer because I'm getting pretty consistent hand raises there. And he put his hand down. Okay, so that's just going to have to be close enough. Okay, so with that, I'm going to show you guys a really quick tweak to make these bounces look a little bit better. Keep this in mind. We'll probably end up doing it again once we get to actually animating this later on. But if we know for a fact that this is as high as we want this ball to be, we can use that to our advantage. The problem with our bounces, the reason they look a little weird, is because these curves are not super, they're not really natural. They've got like this one, it kind of flattens out. It looks a little weird, and that's because we have these excess keyframes. You can take these handles and tweak that around until you get something that looks really nice. Like here, we could probably do something like that, and do something like that. Just give them all a little bit of an upward slant, and you're pretty much good to go. But there's another way. Now, I just want to show this as just kind of a neat trick more than it is anything else. If we go right to this point, if we know for a fact that we want the ball to be at this altitude at this time, Let's move, and I'm going to throw this out real quick. This is just a trick, okay? If you're just trying to make your bounces look good, by all means, just play with these handles and waggle them around. I am not going to give everybody a whole lot of time to do what I'm about to do. It's just a trick. So if we know that our ball needs to be right here pretty much at this time, what I'm going to do is hit Shift-S, and that's going to move the cursor to the selected object. So our 3D cursor goes right to that ball. Then I'm going to hit Shift-A to add an empty. I'm not going to be keeping this empty before you ask. He's not going to be here for too much longer. Next, we'll go to our next bounce, which is at 75, like so. Select my ball again, Shift-A again, and add another empty. Oh, hang on. I did it in the wrong order, forgive me. So with my ball selected, I'm going to hit Shift-S and snap the cursor to select it again because I need the 3D cursor to follow my ball. Then hit Shift-A and add an empty. What I'm doing, the crux of what I'm doing, is I'm putting in an empty at the peak of all of my jumps in 3D space. So now we'll go to 105, same thing. Select the ball, Shift-S, cursor to selected, Shift-A, add another empty. So now I have these 3 empties that tell me where my ball should be at that moment. Cool, right? Now we go over back to the ball. Check this out. Take all 3 of these keyframes. You do not have to do this. This is totally optional. This is just a trick. Delete them. Goodbye. Now watch this. We scrub forward to that same point. Now the ball is much lower because there's no keyframe actually pulling it that high into the air. So now we grab our 2 initial keyframes, and it's kind of like a game of tug of war. We pull this handle up a little bit. We grab this handle. We pull it up a little bit. We do this kind of back and forth tug of war game until our ball is right there where we wanted it to be. So maybe we'll pull that down a little bit. We'll put a little bit more emphasis on the left-hand side. And in doing this, in getting rid of that central keyframe, we end up with a nice, perfectly smooth bounce. Let's go ahead and do the others, and then I'll play back and show everybody what it looks like. So go to 75. Same thing. We'll just do a little bit of tug of war. We'll go ahead and... Actually, we can use the guy on the left to get an idea of about how far to pull that up. And pull up. So right about there. Again, it's not a super exact science. It doesn't really need to be. This can be a little organic. And then 105. Click again, drag up. Click again, drag up. And there we go. Boing, boing, boing. So when you're ready, go ahead and give this a quick playthrough. And there you go. You should have 3 really nice, smooth bounces. And yeah, if you want to do that trick a little later when you rewatch, that's fine. It's just a way to get a nice bounce without any excess keyframes. Okay, so there we go. And now at this point, I want everybody to have a ball that is in some way bouncing up a hill. If you need to tweak it to make the bounces look a little prettier later, that's fine. So is there anybody who does not have a ball bouncing up a hill in some form or fashion? Again, I don't care if it looks pretty. Raise your hand if you don't even have anything that looks pretty. I'm not getting any hands. That's great. That means we can just go ahead and move forward. Okay, our next stage is going to be to get our club swing in place. So what we're going to do is make use of our really, really basic rig and some of the timing we decided in our storyboards. We said that our ball was going to settle in, and we're going to give him about a second or so to do that. Now, there may be some jiggle, some things like that. We are not ready for that. We don't have that worked into our animatic rig, so we're going to ignore that. We're just going to give the overall timing about a second. So I'm going to move my timeline forward. I'm doing this with the middle mouse button, by the way. So just middle mouse drag, like so. And I'll change my start and end time. So if we can assume we're done with the jump now, we can maybe watch like the last little bit of the jump. So we'll start at 1:15, and let's give ourselves about 5 seconds from there, which would be about another 150 frames. So that would be 265. And then we'll just scrub the timeline forward. And I'll probably have to narrow that down a bit further as we go, but that's just a place to begin. Now, I no longer need this right orthographic view. I'm actually going to switch back over to a user perspective view. There are various opinions on whether or not switching over to a perspective view is good for this kind of thing, but it makes me happy, so, that's something anyway. We do not have a golf ball in place. Even as we do the final animation, I don't want you to even think about the golf ball. We're going to put the golf ball in last because we're the animators, and because all of 3D animation is really just a bunch of sleight of hand and magic tricks, we can just make our guy do the nicest swing we can think of, and then after the fact, we can put the ball wherever it needs to be so that he hits it. So if you're sitting going, but where's the golf ball? Don't worry. We don't care about the golf ball right now. What we're going to do is give our little character here a second of pretty much dead time where he's not going to do anything. So starting at 120, we'll go up to 150, and we're just going to add a keyframe. Actually, really, at this point, we're done with the ball altogether. He's not going to move again. Now, you saw in our final animation, which I'm going to bring up just for everybody's sake, and if you'll pardon me, well, I'm going to try to bring it up. Video encoding is awesome. So we'll make that kind of small, rewind and hit play. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's the best, really. Oh, there we go. Okay, so something was wonky, but is now unwonkied. So if you watch, he bounces up the hill, and there's a lot of motion that is inherent to the ball itself. His location is not moving, he's not rotating, but he's bending, he's flexing, and things like that. Things that are not handled in our animatics. Now again, I just want to stress, guys, I know that when you're doing projects on your own, you don't have a render you can go back and do, but just for teaching purposes. So he's going to have, this ball is basically just going to sit here for the rest of the animation and not do anything. Now it's time for us to worry about what the club is doing. Once again, I want to start building good behavior, good habits for your animations. So I want you to be using key sets when you're adding keyframes. I don't want you to just be haphazardly adding keyframes onto stuff because you'll be animating scale and all kinds of stuff that you don't really need to be putting keyframes on. You can do that by creating a custom key set the way we were earlier, or if you're in a rush, you can also just come down here to your key set. We have the club selected, and all we're going to be animating is location and rotation. So we can tell Blender, just animate location and rotation. So now you've seen both ways. If you'd like to go ahead and create a custom keying set for your club, you could do that. You could just go over to your scene. Under keying sets, click the plus key, and we could call this club key set, like so. Now, you'd want to make sure that this is selected. So make sure that you had the club key set selected. Then with your club selected, jump over, take its location, right-click and choose Add All to Keying Set, take its rotation, and choose Add All to Keying Set. But everything I just did is fundamentally the exact same thing as just selecting your club and choosing location and rotation. So, same thing. All right. Now, with all of that done, we are ready to begin our animation process for the club. We're going to start moving the club at about frame 150, which means that our little sphere has sat still for about a second. So we're going to add a keyframe. And now, in less than a second, so not quite a full second, we want him to settle in. We could start it in a second and move it around, but what I'm going to do is, if we know that 30 frames are in the second, I'm going to go to about 25 frames forward. That's about 175. And I'm going to put the club into position. This is going to be a two-part process, folks. Does everybody remember that we had this guy in place, our little, our null here that we're using for the swing? He is going to be responsible, and pardon me for using the masculine pronoun, it is going to be responsible for just doing this and swinging around. But for that to make the most amount of sense, we need to take our club and we need to get it located straight out the front of our character. So that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to switch over to the Move widget. Actually, and let me go ahead and make the screen nice and big for everybody. I'm going to hit Control and the up arrow. This is just to hopefully make it a little easier for you to follow along with what I'm doing. I'm going to position this guy so that the handle is right in front of our ball and the club is pointing straight out from his body. So let's position it about like so. I'm going to have to be doing a lot of rotation and moving. So in the end, you might just want to see how I get this positioned and go from there. So we'll rotate it forward, we'll spin it around so it's rotated about the right direction for a golf club. We'll switch back over to move and just position it pretty much like so. So in the end, all you're really looking for is for the golf club to be sticking straight out of the character's body. Now I'm going to hit Control up arrow one more time, and that gives us some animation. It's not perfect animation, nor do we really need it to be. Again, this is more about timing than anything else. So over the course of a little less than a second, he's going to just kick his golf club straight out. Okay, next thing is we're going to start using our swing null to actually handle the golf swing itself. However, at the moment, that is not added to the keying set. So we're going to jump up to its object mode. We're going to take its just its rotation. We don't need its location changed at all. We're going to right-click on its rotation values and add all to keying set. Now, just to double check something, if we go back over to our scene view and we look underneath our active keying set, check it out. We've got location of the golf club, we've got rotation of the golf club, and we have rotation of the swing null. That's how you can confirm that you have everything that you needed inside of your keying set. Now we're going to do something a little bit fancy. We're going to move two things at the same time because we can do that. Starting at frame 150, we're going to drop a keyframe for our null. So make sure you have the swing null selected and click your little keyframe button. Then we'll scrub up to 185. And I'm going to rotate this downward to put the swing null into position. But there's something really important that is going, I promise you, this is going to be confusing to at least one or two of you, and I'm just going to ask that you bear with me. We are going to need to change the rotation order for this. Now, I don't want to get into a big, long discussion of rotation order when we're already 3 hours in, but watch very carefully what I'm about to do. Before I even rotate, I want to point out that currently we are rotating in global transform orientation mode. What this means is the rotation axes will always be aligned to the axes of our world. Basically, they'll be pointing in the same direction as the axes in the lower left corner of our 3D view. That's not exactly what we want. We want to be able to rotate this guy down, and then we want a nice natural swing along this diagonal direction. Now, your first impulse might be, well, that's fine, Zach. Can't we just click over and set this to local? And the answer is yes. We can do that, and then swing like so. And you'll notice we're getting a nice swing along that diagonal, which looks pretty good, all things considered. The problem is, take a look, as I'm making this swing, cut your eyes over to the right-hand side and take a look at what those rotation values are doing. Do you see that? All three of those rotation values are moving. Now, hopefully, you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute. All I did was click on the blue circle, which is for the z-axis, and that's all I'm dragging. So why are all three rotation values updating? Well, that has to do with rotation order, which is one of those fun things that it requires a little bit of explanation. And the easiest way to visualize it, to see what's actually going on under the hood, is not to use local at all, but instead to make sure you switch your orientation over to Gimbal. Gimbal shows you the result of where your rotation axes really are in relation to one another. Because here's the funny thing, if you didn't already know this, rotations in 3D space are complicated. They are very, very complicated. And to make them easier for programmers to understand and then for us to understand, they've been broken down into a parenting hierarchy. Do you remember how we parented the golf club to the null and we parented the null over to the ball? Well, actually, the axes in your rotation do the same thing. X is actually parented to Y, and Y is parented to Z. Why is this important to you? Well, here's why. I'm going to rotate on the x-axis here, this little red circle, and you'll notice that it looks like our widget doesn't change at all, which is great. That's fine. That's fantastic. But watch what happens if I rotate Y. See what happened right there? the x-axis is now leaned over to the side. It's no longer pointed straight up and down. That's where we start to see the behavior of that parenting hierarchy. X is parented to Y, Y is parented to Z. So what does that mean to us? That means we can rotate X however we want to, and it looks like nothing changes. But as soon as we start to rotate Y, it drags X along for the ride. And then as soon as we start to rotate Z, it's going to drag both X and Y together. Why do you care about this is probably your next question, or at least I hope that's your next question. One of the reasons you care about this is because, one, this is how rotations are actually handled under the hood. And if you don't know this, you can end up with really funny rotations that, when animated, look bad and won't work exactly the way you want them to. Another reason you want to know this is that if you take the y-axis in this case and you rotate it over about 90 degrees, actually perfect 90 is good, you get what is called gimbal lock. If I was to rotate on the x-axis or the z-axis, it's going to look like the exact same motion because of gimbal lock. So what we're going to do, now, if you're confused by this, I don't want you to freak out right now. It's something that you're going to have to play with and get the hang of, and we will talk about a little bit later once we get more into animation. Again, as I said earlier, for these animatics, a lot of this is more of a process of just do as I'm doing. What we want to do is change our rotation order so that when we rotate the club down, our entire gimbal handle, our entire widget, tilts forward so that we can move along a nice natural arc. The short answer to how we do that is we want to make sure that the x-axis, which is how we tilt this down, we want to make sure that that is the highest part of the hierarchy, meaning it's the last letter. If you take a look here next to rotation, we have all these different orders that these can be parented. You'll notice we have standard XYZ. We have XZY, YXZ, every combination you can think of Z, X, and Y. If we choose one of these where X is at the very end, then watch what happens. As soon as we do that, the entire widget has now tilted forward so that now we can swing in this really nice natural arc. The reason for that is that now Z is parented to Y, Y is parented to X. So if we rotate X, it's going to bring along Y and Z together. If we rotate Y, it's just going to bring Z together. Really, we're only worried about X and Z, so we can kind of really, for all intents and purposes, we can ignore Y. As long as X is the third letter, we're fine. That's exactly what we need. So just to kind of show that one more time, because I realized I just kind of spouted off, and somebody just said right there in chat, said, okay, I'm completely lost now. That's fine. The first time you see gimbal rotation and rotation order, you will be lost. You'll probably be lost the second time too, and so for some folks you get lost the third and fourth times, but honestly, you just have to keep in mind that all three of your axes are parented together. If I turn off auto key, and I'm a little apprehensive about doing this. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to do it because I am so apprehensive. Let me just do this real quick. I'm going to give you guys a really, really quick example of something, just to kind of hopefully help out. Let me hit Control up arrow. You do not need to do this to follow along. You just need to watch your screen. I'm going to move this guy way out here into space, so he's kind of alone. I'm going to hit Shift D and Shift D. Now, these are just three spheres. They have nothing to do with axes, or so you think. What I'm going to do is show you a parenting system. So I'm going to take this sphere. Actually, let me put these guys in sort of more of an order. So there we go. I'll take the one on the right, hold down Shift and get the one on the left, and hit Control P and parent him. And you get a little relationship line. Those are so cool. Click that one and click the next one and hit Control P again. So now, I have three spheres that are all parented together. We have the baby child at the very end, and no matter what we do with him, it doesn't matter because children do not affect their parents. Then we have the one in the middle. He affects his child, meaning the one at the end, but he doesn't affect his parent. And then we have the Lord over all, and he just moves everybody whenever he moves. Soganatsu, you said how to turn on the rotation controller. If you mean the widget, you may need to hit Control Spacebar. You might have it hidden. Okay, now back to what I was saying. The three axes when you are in gimbal mode behave just like these three spheres. If you are in X, Y, and Z rotation, it actually would look more like this. It would be in the other direction. Where, oh, you know what I'm going to do? We're going to get just a little bit fancy right now, and if it takes an extra second to make it all make sense, then that's okay. You guys can just thank me later. Let's hit new, and again, you do not have to follow along. You just have to be watching your screen. So if you're like, slow down, I'm going to say no. In fact, it might make me go faster. All right. So we have these 3 spheres, and now I've color-coded them to coincide with your 3 axes, because this is the default behavior for your rotation order, X, Y, Z. X is parented to Y, Y is parented to Z. That means if we do anything with X, if we rotate it, whatever, it doesn't do anything to Y and Z. They remain exactly the same. And that is exactly the same behavior we saw over here by default. So if I take my rotation order that we were looking at just a second ago and I set it back to X, Y, Z, watch this. I rotate X down. Actually, let me grab the correct object. I rotate X down and, oh, hang on, changed the wrong guy. Bear with. Okay, so here he is back in X, Y, Z by default. And if I rotate X down, notice our little widget hasn't changed at all. It looks exactly like it did. That is because X is parented to Y. It's just the child of it. So whatever we do to X doesn't affect Y at all. However, if we were to rotate Y, that affects X, just like our parenting scenario up here. If I take Y and I do something to it, he pulls X along for the ride. And then finally, if I do anything with Z, which I need to undo that rotation to make that make sense. If I do anything with Z, everybody comes along for the ride. And that's because all of the axes are parented to Z, and whatever we do to Z affects everybody. If you're still confused, I'm just going to move on. But it's just a way to look at the parenting hierarchies that drive all of your rotations. The key thing is that we need to change this order. Basically, we need to control this parenting scenario because we want to be able to do a few things. Let me jump over here. I'm going to undo several times until our little club is pointed straight back out again. We want to be able to rotate our club down and have that affect all of our other axes. Basically, we need the x-axis to be at the top of the hierarchy. Put another way, we need to be able to, if I break all of these parents, we need something like this. We need maybe Z to be parented to Y, and Y to be parented to X, so that whatever I do to X is going to affect everybody. It's the same thing as a parenting scenario. Oh, you missed showing the gimbal lock problem, which you'd like to see. That's Mohammed saying he missed that. Hang on, I'll show you in just a second. Oh, come on, Mohammed, you're a Maya user. Surely you've seen gimbal lock once or twice. All right, check it out. All you need to do to really demonstrate gimbal lock is take the axis of whatever's in the middle of your rotation order. So in this case, that would be Y, and rotate it by 90 degrees. So if we spin that by 90... there's gimbal lock right there. Because now to rotate on X or to rotate on Z would give you the exact same motion. So that's a problem. Okay, so hopefully that made, at least it made, it made some sort of sense why we're going to be changing this rotation order. We need X to be the last letter, the highest level in the hierarchy. So ZYX is going to be just as good as YZX. So I'll just grab ZYX for no reason other than that's the one I want. And now here's the great thing. We can rotate this down, and now when we go to swing the club, watch those rotation values. Really only one is changing. Now, the one in the middle, the y-axis, is twitching a little, but that's just Blender. It's not actually changing. It becomes much easier to animate this way now because we have 2 individual keyframes. We know that X is just tilting the club down. We know that Z is just swinging the club around in a circle, and we don't have 3 values all going in helter-skelter directions all at the same time. It just makes things easier. So, now that we've got the club tilted at the ground, and because we're using auto key, let's see, that moved over, and it looks like I never actually put a keyframe right there. So I turned off auto key a second ago, so let's make sure auto key stays on. And now we should end up with our club, if we take a look around, he's being put into position between frames 150 and 185. Like so. Now I'm going to give it that about 10 frames of just kind of sitting there and just being a nice little guy, like he's kind of lining up the shot. So I'll go 10 frames forward and just click the key button. Before I do anything else, who is not with me right now? Raise your hand if you are not with me. I just got one person. 2 people. All right, a few people. All right, what I'm looking for, what you need to have at this point before we go too much further forward, is between frames 150 and 185, you're doing 2 things, but you're doing them at the same time. You are moving the club so that it is straight out, pointed out from the body, and the next step is you're just tilting that empty down a little bit, and you'll notice that becomes a compound motion that puts the club into swing position. We just did it in 2 steps. Step 1 is we moved the club object so that it was lined up with the empty pointed straight out from the body. Step 2, we tilted the empty down, and once you combine the 2 of those, you're putting the club into position. And Chris says, you say you're with me, but it's all messed up. If that's the case, something you may need to do in emergencies, go to your club key set, and you'll have all of your curves showing. You can just hit the home button to see everything. You may need to take all of these keys and just hit the X key and just delete them. Basically, kill off your animation and start over again. Sometimes that's easier when you're just getting started than it is to try to unravel some spaghetti of dropping down a bunch of keyframes you didn't mean to add in the first place. I can't see the keyframe marks on my timeline. How to show them again? One thing would be to make sure you have the proper object selected. So if I have, say, like the ground selected, you'll see I lose all of my tick marks. But if I have something that I've actually animated, suddenly they become visible again. So it's context sensitive. Okay, so at this point, I think we are ready to go ahead and animate our swing. So we're to the home stretch now. So starting at frame 195, which is where we are, we're going to take about a second to do our backswing, so give or take. So from 195 up 30 more is going to be 125, or 225, excuse me. I can do simple math, I promise. And we're going to select our swing null. This is great. All we got to do is just rotate this back along the z-axis. And I'm going to give it some overswing, man. He's drawing all the way back. He's ready to drive this thing like Happy Gilmore. How do you delete a keyframe? Well, there's a couple of ways to do it. The easiest way for the time being would be inside of your graph editor to select the keyframe you want to summarily execute. Just click on it, then tap the X key, or of course the delete button will do it too. And Jen just commented, said he's flexible. Actually, once we do the final animation, we're going to give him some twisting ability, so his body will seem to twist, so he really will look like he's just getting ready to drive this thing off into Oklahoma. Okay, so now we want him to hold this position for just a minute. So he's drawing back and he's holding it like he's building up his energy for the forward swing. So we're going to go forward about half a second. That's 15 frames. So that takes us up to about 240. And I'm just going to add another keyframe right here. Another way to do this, if you don't want to add a keyframe, is just nudge it. So you just take your rotation and just give it the tiniest amount of imperceptible rotation, and that will add a keyframe because it is a value change. If you have a question, please throw it into the actual question area. I don't always get to pay as much attention to chat as I would probably like. Now, we want to do a really fast forward swing. So to keep things simple, we're going to assume that's about a third of a second or 10 frames. So we'll go up to frame 250. And we're just going to rotate the club right back around, maybe about like so. So cross back over its center axis. And now we can just hit Alt+A and we can test this out. So it puts the club into position, swings back, crack. And there you go. All right, so with that done, I'm going to hit Alt+A to stop playback. And I'm going to show my entire timeline now. So we'll set that back over to, well, actually, it should be 1, I believe, instead of 0. And we'll rotate to a view that pretty much coincides with the storyboards. Also, I no longer need these little floating empties I made anymore, so I'm going to select all 3 of those, hit X, enter, and nuke those out. Now, our storyboards give us this kind of downward camera. We're kind of looking a little bit up at our character. And, of course, we may need to kind of scrub back through to get an idea of that, because here he is bouncing up over the hill. In fact, I may tilt the camera down just a little bit more. And the reason I'm doing this is I want our guy to be pretty much hidden when the animation starts. This does not have to be super perfect, partially because, 1, we could make minor edits to the terrain if we needed to. Also, keep in mind we're going to have grass poking up. So if you still see a little bit or some parts of the ball, we'll be able to hide that when we get to the final animation. Not to mention, our final guy has the ability to squash himself down flat as a pancake if we need him to. So we'll leave the view right about here. And I'm going to do something kind of funny. We're just going to tell Blender to use what we're looking at right now as our camera view. So I'm going to hit Control, Alt, and 0 on my numpad. Make sure your mouse is over the 3D view before you do that. And there you go. Now, this could get you pretty close to the right area, but in some cases I've found that it's just zoomed in a little bit too far or a little bit too far out. It'll have the wrong dolly factor. So playback, get an idea of how much of the screen you need, and then what you can do is just go back to camera mode by tapping the 0 key, scroll your mouse wheel out just a little bit, or of course you can use Control and your middle mouse button to pull back, and then just hit Control-Alt-0 again, and you can just play with that until you get just the right positioning. So I'm going to pan up just a little bit. That's closer. That's probably the closest yet. And you want to play back through and make sure you're catching as much of that motion in your camera as you possibly can. The hotkey for camera placement again was Control-Alt-0 on the numpad. So now you can just Alt-A, watch your animatic, brings the club into position, draws back, crack, and he's got a nice swing. For this particular exercise, we're not even going to worry about putting a golf ball in there. We don't need one. You know that there's going to be a golf ball. You know that it's going to get sent sailing off camera right, but the golf ball, for all intents and purposes, doesn't do anything in this animation. It just gets kind of knocked out of view. As a matter of fact, it's going to get knocked out so fast that it's going to look like it more or less disappears. And if you've ever watched golf on TV, that's kind of what it looks like if you're staring at the tee. And how do you increase... you can also select the camera while in camera mode and use G to move it. Yes, you can. So if you want to just select the camera, you can actually click on the outside dotted frame of the camera, and then you can hit G to move the camera around. Of course, you still have access to all of your constraints, so if you hit G and then middle mouse drag, you can zoom in and out. That's pretty easy. And Mohammed's asking, how do you increase the region of the camera? If you mean the field of view, then you can go under the camera settings. If you take a look over in your properties window, there's the object data group. It's got a little camera icon, not like a point and shoot, but an actual movie camera icon. And you'll see that you have a focal length, and you can change that from a 35mm to anything that you wanted. I'm going to leave mine at 35 just for sake of simplicity for this project. I realize that that's not always desirable for most animations. If you'd like to mess with it, by all means, have fun with it. I'm going to leave mine set right there. At least you know how to change it now. Soganatsu, it's more than just time for a restroom break. It's time for folks to ask any final questions you may have. We are actually at the end of this lesson. This is what I wanted all of you to accomplish for today. I wanted to get us all the way through Animatics. If you remember way back like 3 years ago when we started this lesson, I mentioned that this was my my final goal. So now is a good time for folks to start asking any final questions that you have before we go ahead and close things up. Patrick, you say you're so lost with the golf swing. Well, here's probably going to be your best bet because we've already gone so far into it. By the end of the day, this video will be up for streaming. You can jump to a couple of hours in and you'll be able to watch it a second time. And you can just scrub and repeat it as many times as you need to, and I think you'll be able to get it. Now, later on this week, and we're going to announce this time in the Member Sponsor Lounge, I am going to have open office hours, meaning basically there will be a few hours that I will set aside where you can watch this video on streaming, and I will actually be handy in webinar format to answer any questions you may have. So if you're still stuck, then we can talk about that then. But Patrick, also, I just want to mention this too. It's when folks, because I can't just sit over your shoulder. It's not like an actual live classroom where I can walk up and tap you on the back of the head. When you just say you're lost, that doesn't give me a whole lot of feedback to really help pull you back out. If you have specific questions, those are going to work a whole lot better than just saying you're lost. A quick overview of the process is we created a simple rig using that null. And all that did was just give us a point around which we could orbit. We parented the club to that null. And the entire swing process is really, it's just two parts. The first part is moving the club so that it points straight out from the null. The second part of the process is just rotating that null to make a swing. And he says, my problem is the position of the club and the actual swing. I'm sure I just missed this step, which is entirely possible. It is probably kind of easy to do. Just take your time with it. Again, just keep in mind the very simple two-step process. Step 1, put the club into position pointed straight out from the character's body. Step 2, take that null and use that to aim the club down toward the ground and then to animate the swing. And I think you'll be just fine. You will have to pay attention to that pesky rotation order thing, though, or it will look like your character is trying to do a do-si-do or something with his golf club. It looks really funny. Let's see. Next, how do you move a keyframe to a different time? The easiest way I would like you to do that for the time being is through the graph editor. So if you'll pardon me for just a minute while I rotate around my view, and I'm going to hit Alt+A. Let's grab anything we've animated. So to do that, just click on any keyframe that you need to move and hit the G key just like you do in the 3D view, and you can start dragging this around. If you need to move it only in value, which is up and down, you can just middle mouse click and drag vertically, and now you're limited to only moving vertically. If you need to move it in time, hit G and middle mouse drag to the left, and you're only moving in time. And you can see that little keyframe waggling down there on the bottom. Next one. Before you end the video, you really should suggest those who are having troubles watch the Blender Fundamentals videos. And Miranda has a fantastic point. For those of you who are having troubles, you really, really should study up on the Blender Fundamentals videos because those will supplement what we've done here to an extreme degree.
They are free.
And they are free, and you can download them. And let's see. Moving on from there. Let's see, are we going to have homework this week? Actually, if you have followed along with the video all the way thus far, your homework is very easy. Your homework for this week is to complete these animatics and submit them. Now, we are going to, do we have like a standard method for submission right now?
Yeah, there's one that's set up at the moment for the C#.
Okay.
That talks about how it's to be submitted.
Okay, well, look for a thread over in the Member Sponsor Lounge where we'll talk about the submission process. But I'm keeping this first week's homework very, very easy. As long as you have followed along with the video and you have some animatics, then you're good to go. If you'd like to take some time and kind of tweak them, great. I would highly suggest, though, for homework that you do them over again. Now, I'm not ordering you to do that, mostly because I have no way of knowing whether you do it or not, so I can't verify that. But I think it would be really good practice for you to just start a brand new scene and create these animatics completely from scratch. Is there a benefit to limiting your number of keyframes? You mentioned that all the way to the top backstroke to avoid placing a keyframe. Every keyframe you place is just another little bit of calculation that needs to be made. Now, you know, it's a pretty cheap calculation. But later on, once you start really having to play with animation curves, you'll find that the fewer points you have on that curve, the easier it is to play with. So that would be one advantage. If you're getting the motion that you need and you're not noted, like you don't have 8 billion keyframes, then you should be okay. It's kind of a personal preference when you're doing something very simple to keep your keyframes down. Okay. Now, one thing that somebody was mentioning earlier, somebody had said that there were a ton of different keyframes on the screen at one time. Yeah, I'm not seeing that necessarily. I know when I have multiple objects selected, then everything.
You have everything selected.
Yeah, then you can end up with a whole lot of keyframes because you like everything that was animated. Shall we render the homework in Blender or Cycles? No, I actually don't want you to render this at all. I just want you to submit a blend file, non-rendered. We're not going to, because I haven't gone over the process of outputting a video, etc. and so forth. I just want to see a blend file that already has the camera placed. Camera placement is huge. I mentioned that earlier. So get this animation done. Make sure you aim your camera at a nice place to begin the work from, and then that's going to be the extent of your homework. Will we be informed via email or newsletter when and where the video and homework will be available? The video will be available by the end of today. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to begin encoding it just as soon as this class is done. And as far as us notifying students via newsletter, that's not going to happen. We only try to send the newsletters out when we have something to announce to everyone. We leave it to the student to check the member sponsor lounge for posts. It's a good idea for those of you that are taking these online classes, just to kind of keep a watch on those forums. Also, Zach, if you could go ahead and bring 3D Buzz back up real quick.
Yeah.
Just for anybody that came in late, just to show once again where the videos will be. Zach's bringing that over. Thank you. You'll see at the top of any of the 3D Buzz pages, we have our menu. You'll see the live classes link. If you click on that, once this video goes live a little bit later on, right now it says register for Saturday. That will change to watch. And you'll see, just like on Thursday, to the left where it says Intro to C#, the class we had just the other night, now says watch. So this will change to watch. You can click it and watch the video.
Yep. Now, Fat Gav, who's kind of like our TA, he's already said, just to clarify, we submit the same PM address as the C# class itself. I'm sorry, Jen said that. Fat Gav was asking if you can attach blend files to PMs. Actually, you can't make attachments to PMs. Because when you guys were doing code, you're just copy-pasting code into a PM. We're not going to be handling it that way, so there may be an email or something that's going to need to get set up.
Yeah, I'll let you and Gavin discuss what would be best. But yeah, again, we'll make a post about that. And
okay.
That post will be in the member sponsor lounge.
And the deadlines for all homework are 1 week out. So by the time class starts this time next week, you need to have this assignment done. That should be tons of time.
Which means that if you're turning it in the day of class, don't look for feedback that day.
That's right.
It's a little different than in the programming classes.
Yeah, I'll be doing your feedback probably like after the next session. So we'll have to keep it that way. We kind of have to keep it rolling forward. So if you'll bear with me in that, I'd appreciate it. Let's see. I'm looking over questions if you guys are wondering why I just suddenly got quiet. Let's see. Looking to clarify, we submit to the same PM address. We're going to make an announcement about the submissions for homework because now we actually have to have files that are sent your way. So please keep an eye on the Member Sponsor Lounge where we will be making that announcement. How did you keep the movement of the widget with the null in the animation? If I understand your meaning, then that is going to be by... one, setting up our transform orientation to gimbal mode, and then making sure that under the object settings in our properties panel, we set our rotation mode from XYZ Euler to ZYX, and that will mean that it rotated. That's where we got into the big, long discussion over how axes are parented to one another, and where gimbal lock comes from. Were there any other questions?
I think we're about to be wrapping things up here.
Is a camera position switch between keyframes possible? Example, have the camera follow the ball behind its shoulder while jumping the hill and on the hill from the front camera perspective. That is outside the scope of what we're discussing here. If you want to get fancy and go beyond the scope of the things that I discuss, I'm not going to be adding like official support to that in terms of Q&A.
I'll just say this.
But it's easy.
It's easy to do. Right now you could just use your one camera with some stepped keyframes.
Yeah. So I guess to answer your question most directly, yes, it's possible. Which Blender Fundamentals videos do you recommend we watch this week? Anything over the interface will help you. Anything over, well, actually, I mean, honestly, I recommend you watch them all. I really think it's huge for you to have as much of that stuff down as you possibly can, but I realize some of you are going to gasp at that and be like, oh, God, there's no way I could ever watch that. And I understand. But basically, everything over the UI would be good. The properties area would be good. You could probably skip the grease pencil stuff. Basic selection, transformation, transform orientation, origins, object centers, snapping, parenting in the object panel. I mean, all of this stuff would be huge and very useful to all of you. Let's see. So, yeah, I understand. Folks out there are going to be time constrained, and that's just going to be the nature of some of these classes. We have already devoted so much time to putting out so much Blender content that we're really going to be set pretty heavily back if we have to teach everybody everything all over again each time we have a session. So that's why we've got these really great Blender Fundamentals videos to get you up to speed on your own time. Let's see. I can get the translate manipulator, but I cannot get the rotation and scale manipulators to show automatically as in the translation. Any tips on that? No, because I'm not quite sure what you mean. So, I mean, they're showing up just fine here as I switch between them. I've never seen Blender selectively switch one off and not the others, if that's what you're getting at. When I try to rotate, the manipulator doesn't appear. Yeah, I'll have to just look into that. I really have no idea off the top of my head why that would be. I'm thinking that you probably clicked something. That's sometimes that. I mean, I doubt it's gimbal lock if the whole manipulator is gone. Now, one thing you could check, and this would just be, I mean, if you're changing them through this interface, I mean, I imagine they're not switching off in between. So really, I'm not sure. That's just something I'd have to look into. You can do that through the interface. But so, are you saying like when you click on rotate, that your actual rotate manipulator vanishes? Chris just asked, my bounce animation still plays even though I cannot see the keys or change them. You probably have nothing or nothing animated selected. It's possible you have nothing selected at all. Select the bouncing ball and those keys should come back. Oh, when you use the keyboard, the manipulator vanishes. Okay. You mean like when you hit R to rotate? Is that what you mean? If it is, then you got to understand that the keyboard method for moving, rotating, and scaling is completely separate from using these transformation widgets. So it's always going to disappear like that. If, let's say, you want to rotate and you know you want to rotate all around a single axis, you're going to need to tap the R key and then use middle mouse to select what axis you want to rotate around. So you see that little white rubber band line directly underneath my cursor? If I align that primarily with the x-axis, then release middle mouse, now I'm just rotating around x. Like crazy, actually, like a madman. So it's just a different means to go about it. This is something else, just another plug for Blender Fundamentals. All of that stuff is handled over in the transformation videos. Yes, the only way to do that is through the interface. Okay, folks, I am about to bring this to a close. So I'm going to give you guys just a few more seconds to throw in any last-minute questions. Let me hit Control Up. Somebody wants me to play the animation again. I can do that. And actually, if I play it full screen, it might be a little bit laggy. So let me do it up here like so. So we'll hit Alt+A. And actually, I'm going to do something very fancy for you. I'm going to hit the N key. And under Display, I'll turn on Only Render. And I'll turn off the manipulator. And we'll hit N, and there you go. So now that can play through again. Schmack. Okay, cool. And again, please keep an eye on the Member Sponsor Lounge. That is where we're going to announce the video's availability. That's also where we're going to announce how you're going to submit your homework. And with that, I want to thank all of you for showing up. I also want to thank everybody out there who's watching this later on via streaming. And of course, a massive thank you to all of our member sponsors, which includes all of you, but maybe anybody who's not here as well, because member sponsors are really what keep us able to be here. So thank you all so much for your support. With that, good night, everybody. I'll see you all next week.